Hey guys. Tonight we fall asleep to the story of the Inca Civilization, from whispered myths and sky gods to crumbling temples and royal llamas. Picture this cold mist curling over high mountain trails, stone walls beaded with dew, and the distant echo of panpipes bouncing down a gorge so deep, it might as well lead straight to the underworld. You're standing in the clouds. Quite literally. At the edge of the Andes, where civilization is balancing itself on stone terraces, like someone's playing a high-stakes game of Tetris with potatoes, you probably won't survive this. Not because of jaguars or rival warlords, but because you're going to pass out halfway through from sheer historical overload. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when everyone's listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're not born Inca. You're born in the folds of a quilted valley, before the word Inca means empire. There are whispers of the name to come. Sure, but right now, you live in a village of dusty huts. Tucked between two cliffs so steep, the sun takes its sweet time just showing up in the morning. You're wrapped in alpaca wool and chewing coca leaves, squinting into the light as it finally spills over the ridges. Llamas grunt. Birds with blue feathers flick past your ears. The ground is hard, and so is your breakfast. The terrain around you doesn't allow laziness. To survive here, you carve, you terrace, you coax fields out of mountains and water out of rocks. The soil's stingy, the altitude's rude, and the wind doesn't believe in whispering it. Howls like a ghost with a grudge. Yet your people endure, not because you've mastered the land, but because you've learned to respect it like an angry parent with mood swings. You're not alone. All across this jagged range, there are other groups doing the same, farming quinoa, building temples, offering chicha to unseen spirits. Long before anyone talks about the Inca Empire, there are empires already humming here. The Wari, with their mysterious cities and freakishly organized grids. The Chavin, who built tunnels and sculptures that made even your bravest warriors sleep with a nightlight. The Nazca, who just casually etched giant line drawings into the desert for, well, reasons. Historians still argue whether those were astronomical maps, religious texts, or just ancient graffiti drawn by bored priests with altitude sickness. At the heart of many of these groups lies a sacred concept, reciprocity. You give to the land, and the land hopefully gives back. You share with neighbors, and the community weaves itself tighter. You serve your leaders. And if they're not complete narcissists, they might toss you some extra potatoes in the lean season. It's not utopia, but it's not chaos either. Everything's balanced. Barely. Then there's Lake Titicaca. Yes. Go ahead and giggle. It's okay. But to your ancestors, it's no joke. This shimmering, sky-high lake isn't just beautiful, it's sacred. Some say it's where life itself bubbled up from the water. Like soup that accidentally created people. In myth, the god Viracocha emerges from the lake after a global flood, strolls around sculpting humanity from stone, and then vanishes across the ocean like a mysterious beach uncle. You grow up hearing stories about beings that aren't quite gods and not quite human. A man who commands the sun. A woman who births the moon. Spirits in every stream. Every hill. Every alpaca that looks at you funny. Reality feels thin here. Like the veil between worlds might rip open at any moment and let something very old and very judgmental peek through. Eventually, the word reaches your village of a new group gaining strength. They're carving out a place called Cusco, small at first, but stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery. Rumors say they worship the sun like a favorite uncle, wear shimmering jewelry, and have leaders who walk like they're allergic to dirt. They call themselves the Inca, which simply means ruler, arrogant. Right, but you'll soon learn it's justified. And as you trudge down a fog-wrapped path toward this rising city, the air crackles with something ancient. Not just thunder, not just tension, destiny. Maybe, or at least the smell of roasted maize. In the city, Cusco, things feel different. The stones don't just sit there, they fit. You can't even slip a knife blade between them. The walls lean slightly inward, like they're listening. You notice how people pause before entering temples, touching the doorway with reverence. You hear about Manco Capac and Mama Aklo, the legendary siblings sent by the sun god to bring order to chaos. Armed with a golden staff and far too much confidence, Manco supposedly founded Cusco, where the earth swallowed the staff like an RSVP from the gods. But was Manco real? Or a useful piece of propaganda? Historians still argue whether the Incas' founding myths were actual memories, or carefully constructed origin stories designed to make you kneel faster. Either way, the myths work. You're kneeling. Everyone's kneeling. The city, still small, thrums with energy. There are workshops pounding out gold trinkets shaped like frogs, spiders, and whatever fever dreams the artisans had last night. Young boys race messages on foot, dodging chickens and elders muttering about omens. Priests chant beside fires, laced with llama fat. It's the kind of place that makes your bones feel busy just standing still. You notice a quirk. No writing. Not the alphabet you might expect. Anyway, instead, people carry cords, long ropes, knotted in ways that seem meaningless until you realize they're not. These are quipu, talking strings. Records of everything from corn harvests to troop counts to probably some poor soul's overdue taxes. You wonder who can read them. And the answer is not you. Only the Quipucamayaks know that magic, like the world's first spreadsheet sorcerers. They hold knowledge in thread and twist. The sun sinks behind the ridgeline. Shadows stretch across the plaza. The stone city glows gold as firelight flickers through temples and windows. You find a spot near the fountain and lie back. Your neck hurts. Your lungs burn. But your spirit hums like the wind through a reed flute. Something big is starting. You don't know it yet. But the people you've met today, the builders, the runners, the priests with their impossibly shiny cloaks, are about to reshape a continent, and you'll be right here for it. You drift back into the fog still stretched out beneath that Cusco sky, but now the air thickens with time. The walls around you dissolve, reforming into something older. A stranger. Quieter. You're slipping backward. Way before the Inca were anyone important. Before Cusco. Before Manco. Before llamas carried taxes across empires or gods, wore sun-shaped earrings, you're walking among their ancestors now. Barefoot on cracked altars and dusty trade paths carved by people whose names only survive in scattered pottery shards and the panicked footnotes of Spanish chroniclers. You pass through the highland settlements of the Chavin. It's the 900s BCE. And some shaman just offered you fermented corn beer in a ceramic cup shaped like a screaming jaguar. Very casual. Their temple at Chavin de Huantar is a twisting maze of shadowy tunnels, echoing chambers, and secret stairwells that make it feel like someone built an escape room inside a haunted jungle gym. You follow the strobe flash flicker of torchlight to the Lanzone, a massive granite monolith carved with an otherworldly figure that might be human, might be feline, or might be something else entirely. People worship here under the influence of strange plant-based brews. The sounds of flutes reverberating off stone seem to speak, or maybe you're just a little too relaxed now. Historians still argue whether the Chavin were an empire, a religion, or just the cultiest social club south of the equator. You try not to panic as a priestess in owl feathers offers you a hallucination in a cup with the smile of someone who definitely knows how this ends. You politely decline and scurry out. The Chavin fade into the mist. You blink, and the Wari appear. They don't chant, they organize. It's the 6th century CE, and the Wari have built something resembling a real city-state. Their capital, Huari, isn't much to look at from afar. Stone, gray, bland, but up close, it's a planner's dream. Straight streets, multi-story compounds, and the earliest known efforts at standardized government buildings in the Andes, bureaucrats with obsidian inkwells. Just kidding, they didn't write either. Patrol streets like proud pigeons, and canals run through the city like veins. The Wari don't mess around. They create the first versions of terrace agriculture that'll later make the Inca famous, and they probably invent the idea of a labor tax service that the Inca will later borrow, remix, and push to extremes. Still, they vanish mysteriously. Climate collapse, civil unrest, one massive llama strike. Historians still argue whether the Wari collapsed because of prolonged droughts or because someone really messed up harvest season math. You tiptoe away as their empire crumbles behind you. Stone by stone, now you're with the Nazca. It's dry, extremely dry. You're somewhere along the southern coast where rain visits less often than comets. But what the Nazca lack in moisture, they make up for in mystery. You're standing next to a giant hummingbird. Not a real one. A line drawing so massive you can't see it unless you're floating. But you're not floating. You're dusty and sunburned and wondering how the Nazca managed to scratch an image hundreds of feet long into the desert floor without so much as a drone or a single aerial photograph. You walk its lines, careful not to disturb them, wondering what it means. A map, a ritual path, a giant thank you card to sky gods with poor eyesight. You may never know. Nobody does. That's kind of their thing. You keep walking. Farther up into the mountains now, where time loops back in on itself. The people here, Proto-Quechua speakers, are farming, weaving, herding. They're mostly peaceful, mostly local. But here and there, you spot something brewing. Ceremonial centers, hilltop forts, a taste for power. Tribes grow, conflicts simmer. At night, villagers trade stories by firelight about strangers who walk like kings and dreams of unity that don't involve your neighbor stealing your alpacas. Then lightning strikes figuratively, or maybe literally. You've lost track of real weather versus myth by now. From the swirling myths emerges a name, Manco Capac. He doesn't show up with an army. He shows up with a story, born of the sun god Inti. He and his sister wife Mama Aklo rise from the sacred waters of Lake Titicaca and wander the earth. Golden staff in hunt, seeking a place where the earth swallows the rod and says, "Build here, And wouldn't you know it, that place turns out to be Cusco. Very convenient for later kings trying to prove divine legitimacy. You may not buy the whole myth, but the timing is suspiciously perfect. Around the 12th century, the Inca begin their climb. And not just up mountains, they climb in influence, alliances, and prestige. Small at first. A village tribe. No bigger than their neighbors. But something's different. A drive. A belief. An idea that they weren't just another family squabbling over grazing rights, they were chosen. You find yourself walking in their footsteps as they gradually absorb rivals, sometimes with kindness, sometimes with cleverness, and sometimes by shoving spears where the sun doesn't shine. They carve Cusco into terraces and plazas. They invent a local dialect of Quechua, spread through trade and gossip. They build small temples to the sun, and bigger ones to their ambitions. You pass a workshop where stonecutters experiment with angled walls, slightly sloped inward to survive earthquakes. And you think, that's clever. Terrifyingly clever. But they're still not a superpower yet. Their neighbors, like the Chanca and the Kilki, aren't impressed. In fact, they're planning to crush Cusco like a bug under a bronze sandal. You duck as a spear whistles past your ear. Turns out, you've just walked into the Chanca invasion. It's brutal. It's fast. And the Cusco leadership is panicking. The reigning Inca Viracocha Inca is so shaken, he flees. His son stays behind. That son is Cusi Yupanqui. He'll soon rename himself Pachacuti, he who shakes the earth. But not quite yet. For now, he's just a prince with a chip on his shoulder and a knack for military strategy. He rallies the few defenders still in the city, organizes a shock defense, and turns the Chanca tide so decisively that people begin whispering, maybe he's not just lucky. Maybe the sun god likes him better. Maybe destiny just punched in for the night shift. As the Chanca flee, you pick up a discarded shield and follow Pachacuti's gaze out over the valley. Cusco survived. But it won't just survive anymore. It will conquer. So you keep walking. Through history. Through stories. Through time that hums beneath your bare feet like the buzz of something massive, waiting to rise. The Inca haven't built their empire yet, but you can feel it in the stones. You're standing on the edge of something huge. And this time, there's no turning back. You blink, and it's dawn again over Cusco, not the fragile village from before, but something sturdier now, something newly dangerous. You're sweeping the courtyard outside a palace that didn't exist a few years ago. And it's because of one man. Cusi Yupanqui is no longer just the brave prince who saved the city. He's Pachacuti now, Earthshaker, the founder of what will become the largest empire in pre-Columbian America. And you are about to spend the rest of your life watching him rearrange the world like it's his personal chessboard. The name Pachacuti isn't subtle. It means total transformation, cataclysm. Even, it implies he didn't just survive a war, he rewrote history with it. His first move, as emperor, redesigned the capital. The old Cusco, with its winding paths and cozy village vibes, gets bulldozed in spirit, if not in stone. You're recruited okay, ordered to help carve new walls that slant just so, to survive the next earthquake, like a smug shrug. You heave boulders into place beside builders whose precision would make a Swiss watchmaker feel sloppy. No mortar, no gaps, just muscle, geometry, and what may or may not be supernatural guidance from mountain spirits with architectural degrees, Pachacuti's vision isn't limited to walls. He reorganizes the empire's very soul. The state becomes a mirror of his design. Cusco itself gets mapped into the shape of a puma, because of course it does, with the Temple of the Sun at its heart. 4 major roads branch from the city like arteries, forming the backbone of something new, Tawantinsuyu. The 4 parts together: north, south, east, west, each quarter a province with its own flavors, dialects, climates, and very confused bureaucrats trying to make the same festival calendar work in both rainforest and high desert. You get assigned to the northwest quarter, Chinchaisuju, where the climate is humid and the mosquitoes have anger issues. You're a messenger now. Akasqui. Your job is to sprint up and down mountain trails, carrying verbal reports, knotted strings, and the occasional, very confused baby llama wrapped in royal textiles. There are Tambo's way stations every few miles. You're supposed to rest there. But you never do. You're racing time itself. And every step takes you deeper into a realm that's less tribe, more machine. You realize something as you run: this isn't just conquest. It's consolidation. Villages don't get burned unless absolutely necessary. More often, they're absorbed like soft bread into thick soup. Local leaders get co-opted into imperial service. Your gods aren't erased, they're adopted. Then folded into a giant solar family tree with Inti at the top, and everyone else as mildly respected cousins. You return to Cusco with sore legs and blisters that scream in 5 dialects. But the city is booming. There are new plazas, sun temples plated in gold, so bright it actually hurts to look at them directly. And wait. Is that a water fountain shaped like a puma spitting chicha? Yes. Yes. It is. Welcome to the imperial aesthetic. Pachacuti isn't done. He builds Machu Picchu, yes. That Machu Picchu high in the Andes where clouds cling to every stair. It's not a city. Not really. More like a royal retreat. A ritual sanctuary. And possibly the world's most overbuilt vacation home. You climb the narrow path to its gate, your knees silently filing a grievance. Inside, the stones are even cleaner cut than Cusco's, and the terraces spill down the slopes like green staircases to nowhere. You hear whispers that it's aligned to solstices, that its windows are sun traps, that its whole design hums with celestial math. Historians still argue whether it was a seasonal resort, a spiritual laboratory, or just Pachacuti's mountain flex. Back in Cusco, the mummified ancestors of past rulers are getting really awkwardly involved in politics. You watch attendants feed maize beer to a bundle of preserved royal remains wearing a crown. Nobody finds this weird. In fact, Pachacuti is setting a trend because once a ruler dies, he's not really gone. He becomes a sacred entity, consulted through mediums, and moved around like the quietest VIP guest at every ceremony. You start to think maybe the Inca concept of retirement was more dramatic than most. Still, the living ruler casts the longest shadow. Pachacuti's reforms reach deep. He creates storehouses stuffed with freeze-dried potatoes and salted meat to prepare for famine. He assigns land to every family, but keeps the best plots for the state and son. Everyone works under the MITA system now, mandatory labor in return for infrastructure, protection, and the vague honor of occasionally freezing on a mountainside, hauling rocks uphill for 16 hours. You participate in a massive expansion project one summer. You and dozens of others are tasked with extending the Cupacñan, the royal road system, It's more than a road. It's a symbol. Thousands of miles of stone paths winding through mountains, jungles, deserts. Every province connects to Cusco like nerves to a brain. You stumble on a swinging rope bridge hanging over a canyon so deep, it gives you vertigo just looking at it. Crossing it feels like dancing with death while holding a llama by the tail. You're fine. The llama's fine. The bridge. Let's not talk about the bridge. Years pass. The empire grows. Pachacuti sends armies in all directions. Diplomats follow close behind, smiling politely, offering gifts, marriage, alliances, and the occasional mild threat. It works. Tribes submit. Fortresses rise. New cities echo Cusco's geometry. The sun's reach stretches wider than any previous Andean civilization dared. By the time Pachacuti is an old man, his legacy is undeniable. Not just land, not just power, but order, predictable, functional, terrifyingly efficient order. He dies. Eventually. As all mortals must, even earth shakers. But not really. His mummy gets its own palace. His family keeps his wealth. A new ruler takes the throne. But the old one still advises from beyond. You attend his funeral. It involves gold masks, dancing nobles, and a panther's skin, so plush it makes your sandals feel inadequate. It also involves a tax increase, because someone has to keep paying for these elaborate death anniversaries. Now the emperor is Tupac Inca Yupanqui, Pachacuti son. He's ambitious, too, but with a different flavor. If Pachacuti was the hammer, Tupac is the needle stitching up loose ends, refining borders, launching naval expeditions. Yes, naval. He supposedly sails west from the coast and discovers strange islands. Historians still argue whether he actually reached Polynesia or just found some very confused pelicans. Either way, he returns with stories, feathers, and the sense that the empire's not finished yet. But neither are you. You step back and look around. From where you stand on a sun-warmed terrace above Cusco, the empire spreads out like a cloak, rich, regulated, and strangely peaceful for something so large. It's easy to forget how recent this all is, how quickly one man's will reshaped a region, and beneath your feet, the stones hum with the memory of it. You don't know it yet, but you're standing on the rib cage of a jaguar. Cusco, capital of the Inca Empire, is no random sprawl of huts and temples. It's a beast in stone. From the air, if you could float like a condor, you'd see it the head to the north at the fortress of Sacsayhuaman. A body stretching through the city's winding lanes, and a tail curling into the southern hills. The layout isn't just clever, it's cosmological. You're not living in a city. You're living inside a worldview. You brush your hand along a wall and feel how the stones breathe. Each one is shaped, shaved, placed without mortar, and tilted slightly inward. These are not haphazard rocks. These are puzzle pieces so snug that centuries later they'll outlast earthquakes that flatten modern buildings. And let's not even talk about that one stone with 12 sides. Each edge locking into the next, like it's part of a secret handshake. Historians still argue whether these joints were mathematical genius, divine inspiration, or just one really obsessive stonemason with nothing better to do. You're summoned to a new job, helping build a shrine. It's not for a god. Exactly. It's for the huacas, sacred objects, places, even people. In the Inca worldview, holiness isn't always dramatic. A particularly shaped rock can be divine. A spring where a snake once drank sacred. Your great-aunt's favorite tree. You'd better not chop it down unless you want terrible crop yields and a haunting. You're told the shrine you're building will honor a boulder that spoke in a dream. You do not question this. You nod and start stacking bricks. The center of the city, both literal and spiritual, is the Coricancha, or golden enclosure. You sweep its courtyard one morning under the watchful gaze of a temple attendant. And let's just say, you've never seen this much gold in one place in your entire life. The walls are paneled with sheets of the stuff. Inside are statues of Inti, the sun god, glittering like firelight solidified. You hear rumors of a garden made entirely of gold stalks of maize. Llamas, butterflies, all life-sized, all forged from the empire's most precious metal. That one's not a rumor. You see it with your own eyes, and briefly consider stealing a golden potato. Then you remember what happens to thieves in a society where everyone knows everyone, and even the rocks are considered informants. It's not all temples and sparkle. Around you, the empire is ordering itself with mathematical neatness. Every citizen belongs to an Ailu, a clan-like community that shares land, tools, and responsibilities. You work your family plot in 3 sections, 1/3 for the state, 1/3 for the sun, God, and 1/3 for yourself. On paper, that's fair. In practice, it means a lot of squinting into dusty soil, wondering why the sacred third always seems to have the nicest llamas. You're also part of a census now, whether you like it or not. Quipucamayaks, those knot-string record keepers, are showing up more often, fingers flying over cords, muttering things like 27 adults, 4 ceramic bowls, 1 suspicious goat. There's no written alphabet, no ink, but the Quipu system is absurdly complex. Even a single string can contain numerical data, historical events, or even putri. If you know how to read the pattern, you do not. You once tried and ended up tying your own sleeves together. There's a lot to keep track of because the empire is massive. The 4 quarters of Tawantinsuyu stretch from modern-day Colombia to Chile. It span desert coasts, rainy forests, and icy peaks that make your nostrils hurt. You've heard tales of over 30,000 kilometers of roads tying it all together. You've walked some of them. Most have no wheels rolling over them, because the Inca never quite got around to inventing the wheel in a practical sense, go figure, but they're used by runners, soldiers, llamas, and every tax official imaginable. Speaking of which, you've started paying taxes now. Not in coins, they don't have those. You pay in labor, goods, and service. You weave cloth for the state, raise guinea pigs for the temple, and spend 2 months hauling cut stones up hillsides. It's called mita, and technically it's not slavery. Technically, but you're also not allowed to say no. So maybe don't try explaining that nuance to your sore feet. You stop by a kolka, a storage house, on your way back from a work assignment, and it's full of freeze-dried potatoes, called chunyo, and salted meats. These things last for years, and they're your lifeline during famine. Every region has its own stash, part of an intricate system that would make modern logistics managers weep with admiration. You get your ration, nod to the guard, and trudge home feeling oddly cared for and slightly controlled, like a guinea pig in an exceptionally well-planned cage. The more the empire expands, the more it absorbs. You watch officials teach Quechua to new territories, not with threats, but with songs, stories, and jokes. You learn it's less about erasing old cultures and more about creating a common tongue. Some resist. Some adapt. Some pretend to adapt while secretly slipping old gods into new rituals. The empire's reach is powerful, but not omnipotent. Your cousin joins the army. Not because he's bloodthirsty, he's terrified of spiders, but because military service is a fast track to social status. The army is professional, disciplined, and surprisingly well-dressed. Tunics indicate rank. Feathered headdresses denote courage. Victory parades involve singing, juggling, and once a very awkward skit about rival chiefs that made everyone stare at their sandals. They march with slings, spears, and axes with bronze edges, moving in formations so tight they could double as woven rugs, and behind them priests, carrying sun emblems, because even battle is sacred. Then there's your annual Inti Raymi festival, celebrating the winter solstice and honoring Inti Y, the sun god. Everyone from farmers to nobles gathers in Cusco's main plaza. The high priest chants as the Sapa Inca appears, decked in robes that shimmer like sunrise. He raises his arms. The people cheer. You cheer too. Though part of you is focused on whether there will be sweet corn cakes this year. There usually are. You tear into one while watching dancers with painted faces whirl through smoke and incense. You notice something during this ritual, how the emperor is not just a ruler, but a bridge between heaven and earth, between ancestors and the present, between all these provinces now bound under one name. The Incas don't believe in chaos. Everything is ordered, tidy, accounted for. The Sapa Inca, they say, is the child of the sun, and if he stumbles, the whole system might collapse. That thought lingers. You walk home past fields of quinoa and golden-tasseled maize, wondering how long something this big can really last. But the stars above Cusco are bright tonight, and the wind smells like wood smoke and earth. For now, at least, the jaguar still breathes. You wake with frost on your lashes, curled beside a cooking fire that's gone stubbornly cold. The air at this altitude bites, but you're used to it. You rub your hands together, step outside, and the morning greets you with mist slinking off the slopes and the sound of Chasqui royal runners barreling down the stone path. One of them pauses, hurls a message pouch into your hands, and vanishes again without breaking stride. It smells faintly of alpaca and urgency. Inside are quipu cords, knotted strings that mean nothing to you and everything to the empire. Someone, somewhere, will interpret these loops and loops of woolen grammar, translating them into troop numbers, crop tallies, or maybe a report about a llama festival gone horribly wrong. This is how you're ruled by runners. Knots, and a language that ties the empire together even tighter than stone. And that language, it's called Quechua. Not everyone's fluent yet, but they're working on it. The Sapa Inca has decided that communication equals control, so you've been sitting in community halls, listening to traveling storytellers retell myths in Quechua, laughing awkwardly when everyone else laughs, because you're still not sure if Apiu means mountain god or just a very large turnip. Quechua isn't just a way to talk, it's an idea. A soft conquest. A velvet net flung over 4 corners of the empire, pulling in people from the jungle, the desert, and the coast. The stories told in it slowly reshape minds. You hear the tale of Viracocha again. This time with new details. In this version, he walks among mortals, teaches agriculture, scolds greedy nobles, and then disappears across the sea. The moral order is good. Chaos is bad. And don't question authority unless you want a divine timeout. Alongside spoken Quechua is a strange dance of silence, the quipu. You try, once more, to understand the chords. A traveling Quipucamayak is kind enough to give you a demonstration. He holds up a primary chord, several smaller threads hanging from it like ivy from a tree branch. H color, twist, and knot placement means something: red for warriors, green for crops, yellow for maize. A knot low on the thread. That's the number 5. A knot high, maybe 5,000. But it's not just math. The storyteller claims some chords contain narratives, events, stories. Afan Putri. Historians still argue whether the Quipu recorded phonetic words or just ideas. Either way, you nod respectfully and back away before you tangle yourself into imperial debt. The runners fascinate you more than the chords. The Chasqui, always dashing through altitude like they're racing thunder. You try shadowing one for a day. That was a mistake. You last maybe 4 miles before your lungs file a complaint and your knees mutiny. The Chasqui, though, they make it look easy. Each one runs a segment, then passes the message like a baton at one of the empire's many tambos, rest houses stocked with water, food, and, sometimes, cocoa leaves to chew when the mountains get rude. The runners are the nervous system. They move information faster than any other civilization, without wheels or horses. Word of a harvest reaches Cusco within days. A rebellion in the north. The emperor knows before the rebels even finish their angry speech. Orders travel back just as fast, which is great for maintaining control, and less great when you're the village caught shortchanging the state on potato taxes, which you definitely didn't do. By the way, just to be clear, you cross a rope bridge that sways like an overconfident spiderweb. Below, the river hisses at you. Furious and freezing, you inch your way across. Grateful for the engineers who wove these bridges from dried grass and sheer willpower. They're rebuilt every year by local communities, who treat the process like a festival, and a trust fall into tradition. You find it comforting, until you remember that sometimes the punishment for rebellion is having your bridge mysteriously not get repaired that year. Whoops. One day, you help guide a foreign delegation through the roads. They're from a region newly absorbed into the empire. Their leader stares suspiciously at everything: the grain stores, the temples, even the stone drainage gutters, like he's trying to figure out if submission is worth it. You watch him walk into a tambo and see his face soften slightly at the sight of warm stew and a cot. That's the trick. The Inca don't just conquer with soldiers. They conquer with infrastructure, give people comfort, safety, and a convenient rest stop every 15 miles. And they start to forget they were conquered at all. Later, you hear stories about distant villages resisting. Not violently, just quietly. Some speak their old languages in secret. Some hide forbidden shrines in caves or behind waterfall curtains. The empire knows, of course, but it picks its battles. Not every fight is worth waging when the land itself is already so hard to survive. You return to Cusco for a festival and find yourself swept up in preparations. The streets are scrubbed clean. Llamas are combed, decorated with tassels and bells. You're assigned to hang textiles over doorways bright. Geometric patterns woven by hands far more skilled than yours. Every image tells a story. Lightning gods, farming cycles, mountain spirits, and the occasional stylized puma that looks more like a startled cat. You do your best not to hang anything upside down. You failed twice. The festival begins with music panpipes and drums that echo off the walls like thunder with a beat. Dancers appear, faces painted, costumes shimmering with feathers and gold foil. They spin and stomp in rhythms that tell stories older than the empire itself. A man beside you leans in and whispers that some of the dance steps are actually a mnemonic device encoding directions to sacred sites or agricultural techniques into the choreography. You pretend to understand and nod sagely. Then comes the highlight, the Sapa Inca, radiant in his royal tunic. Enters the square. The crowd hushes. He raises his arms. And the crowd responds, like they've rehearsed it for years. Maybe they have. You do too. Because in this world, ritual is language. Ceremony is law. And everyone knows the steps, even if they sometimes miss a beat. The empire may feel rigid, but beneath that stone exterior, it's alive, pulsing, breathing, changing. Words travel faster than armies now. Roads curve through impossible terrain. Stories in Quechua replace rumors in older dialects. And the quipu strings twisting silently in 1,000 storerooms remember everything. You sit beneath a carved pillar, the music fading. Your legs sore from dancing. Above you, the sky burns with stars. Below, the empire murmurs in 100 different voices, all connected by stone paths, sacred chords, and the quiet, relentless rhythm of footsteps on the road. The sun cracks over the mountains, like a slowly opened gold coin. And before your breakfast's even warm, you're summoned, not by a priest or messenger, but by gossip, those loud whispers that always find you before anything official does. The Sapa Inca is holding court today, which means you and every other half-awake citizen in Cusco will pack into the main plaza like beans in a gourd. Waiting for the God King to make his glittery appearance, you sigh, slap the dust off your cloak, and start walking. You know what's coming. Pageantry, symbolism, that awkward mix of awe, and please don't trip in front of the emperor. As you arrive, you see the guards in formation, faces blank as granite. The noble families are already assembled, each clan marked by elaborate headdresses that look like entire aviaries dyed for fashion. Then he appears, the Sapa Inca, son of the sun, lord of the four quarters. And yes, his robe does shimmer like it was stitched from actual rays of daylight. You've heard it said that no one is allowed to look directly into his face. Some say it's because he's sacred. Others mutter it's because he gets cranky when people notice his under-eye bags. Historians still argue whether that rule was religious dogma or just really effective crowd control. But here's the thing. He believes it too. He believes he is divine. And after a morning watching the way people bow, chant, and nearly weep when he raises a golden staff, it's hard not to believe it a little yourself. He walks like the earth rearranges itself to accommodate his steps. His voice is calm and deliberate, shaped by ceremony and years of being listened to, like thunder. Today he announces a temple expansion and a series of marriages between noble houses to cement loyalty. You pretend to be interested, but your eye is on the textile draped across his shoulders, a fabric so fine it probably took 1,000 hours to weave. In this empire, cloth is more than warmth. It's status. It's currency. It's holy. You return home and try not to trip over the loom in your doorway. Everyone's weaving something: tunics, sashes, sling bags, decorative panels. You sit beside your aunt, who's already half-finished a new design, featuring stylized condors and a thunderbolt motif. She hands you a spindle, and you do your best not to embarrass yourself. Textiles here don't just clothe people. They speak a warrior's rank, a noble's lineage. Even which province you belong to, it's all embedded in threads, patterns, colors. Your cousin once accidentally wore the wrong tunic and was mistaken for a tax collector. He still hasn't recovered. You visit a state warehouse, one of the cuelcas, where bolts of cloth are stacked in neat rows alongside baskets of dried fish, clay pots, and ceremonial snuff. This isn't just storage. It's empire management. The Inca elite track what's available, who needs what, and how to move it. And when you realize how many people work these systems, you understand something. This place runs on people, not coins. It's the world's most sophisticated barter machine. You give labor. You get security. You give obedience. You get order. But it's not just about getting fed and clothed. You're part of something larger, a spiritual order. The gods are everywhere here. You pray to Inti, the radiant sun god, with arms raised at dawn. But there's also Mama Quilla, the moon goddess, patron of women, Tithis, and certain types of poetic vengeance. There's Alapa, god of thunder, who carries a club and a water jug and is possibly responsible for the time lightning. Hit your cousin's laundry line. You take part in rituals that feel as old as stone. At planting time, offerings are buried. Corn, coca leaves, llama fetuses, and the occasional chicha-drenched guinea pig. You whisper to the apis, the mountain spirits begging for clear skies, good soil, and no unexpected landslides. You're not religious in the modern sense. You're relational. You negotiate with nature, the cosmos, and your own mortality on a daily basis. Still, nothing, says spiritual terror, like an eclipse. When the sun disappears, you and everyone else drop what you're doing and throw offerings into fire. The priests chant louder. The birds stop singing. The llamas get nervously quiet. You grip your own tunic, muttering apologies for every time you disrespected the sun. When the light returns, you collapse with relief and swear to be slightly less sarcastic in future prayers. Slightly. The empire's rulers use this fear and reverence as carefully as they use their armies. The Sapa Inca doesn't just govern. He embodies the gods. His body is sacred. His breath, a blessing. His waste collected and ritually buried. Because even his poop has spiritual significance. You're still wrapping your head around that. Once, you're invited to witness the Kapakhucha, a ceremony meant to bind the provinces together and honor the sun. Children, pure and noble-born, are selected as messengers to the gods. They're dressed in fine clothes, fed like royalty, and then escorted to mountaintops where they don't come back. You watch from a respectful distance as a caravan of priests and attendants vanish up a trail winding into the snow. It's supposed to be an honor. You tell yourself that You try not to imagine their last breath freezing in the thin air. That night, you dream of mountaintops and silent sacrifices. You wake with a prayer on your lips and a weird craving for roasted corn. Meanwhile, the emperor prepares for a royal procession. You're assigned to help pave the temporary road, because nothing says divine presence like an emergency highway. The Sapa Inca doesn't just travel. He transforms the landscape wherever he goes. Villages scramble to clean streets, build shrines, decorate paths with petals and feathers. He arrives carried on a litter, his face obscured by a fringe of golden threads. So holy, he doesn't even walk among mortals anymore. He stops at temples, blesses springs, receives offerings of obsidian knives, coca leaves, and exotic parrots that look utterly miserable at this altitude. You bow until your knees ache. When he passes, the air feels different, thinner, charged. Whether it's spiritual or just the dust, you're never sure. Later, when the royal caravan leaves, the village sighs with relief. The feast is over, the drama gone. You find yourself back in the routine of planting, weaving, howling. The rituals continue less grand, more intimate, a blessing before meals, a song for the moon, a whispered apology to the spirit in your cooking fire after you overcooked the beans. This is how you live, beneath gold-covered temples and above trembling earth, serving a god who wears sandals, following rules written in thread and string, praying to mountains that sometimes answer. The empire thrives. And you, woven into its fabric like a bright thread, drift off with the rhythm of footsteps in stone streets, the scent of burning sage, and the glint of sunlight bouncing off the golden fringe of the living sun. You wake to the scent of boiling maize and wet alpaca fur, which can only mean one thing: tax season. Don't panic. It's not what you think. No coins, no surprise OD. Just bundles of cloth, jars of fermented corn beer, and possibly a duck. You shoulder your load and make your way to the communal storehouse, where your offerings will be weighed, counted, and stored alongside 1,000 other tributes from your Ailu. It's how things work here. Everyone gives, and the empire keeps score with knots. You've started to understand the rhythm. Every family grows crops, not just for themselves, but for the empire and for the gods. 1/3 of your field's harvest goes to the state, 1/3 to Inti, the sun god, and the rest stays with you. Technically, it's at a table. Emotionally, you still resent that the best potatoes always seem to end up in a golden bowl at the temple, while your family eats the ones shaped like confused frogs. Today, though, there's excitement in the air. A royal inspection. Some mid-level administrator with a very pointy hat is visiting to make sure your village is fulfilling its obligations. You sweep the plaza, comb your hair, and try not to look like someone who once accidentally bartered state corn for a guinea pig-shaped flute. The official arrives with a small entourage, a kipu assistant, and the look of a man who hasn't smiled since the last solar eclipse. He counts your bundles, eyes your grain jars, and gently pats the head of your most promising llama. Then he says something that freezes your spine. Mita rotation begins next week. Ah, yes. The Mita. That beloved, government-mandated voluntary labor service. You've done it before. Everyone has. It's how the empire gets things built. Temples, roads, bridges, fields, and you're up next. Again, your assignment this time terrace farming. You're carted off to a valley where the land is too steep to do anything useful unless you get creative. So that's what you do. You and a team of 30 others carve horizontal steps into the hillside like you're slicing a giant green cake. Each terrace is edged with stone, filled with soil, and irrigated through channels. You dig with painfully handmade tools. The air is thin. Your back aches. Your hands look like they got into a fight with a rock and lost it. But the view? It's breathtaking. You can see half the valley from up here. Rows of maize and quinoa shimmer below like a woven cloth. Condors wheel overhead. And somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of panpipes floats on the wind. Because apparently this is a movie now. You're proud of your work. It's grueling. Yes, but these terraces will feed hundreds. They're engineered with such precision that they control erosion, conserve water, and make the land actually work with you instead of against you. It's Inca ingenuity at its finest. Even a century later, people will still stare at them in disbelief, trying to figure out how you made it all fit so perfectly. There's a kind of quiet dignity in Mita. You know your labor contributes to something greater. But there's also exhaustion, and a creeping suspicion that voluntary isn't really the right word when you've never seen anyone successfully refuse. Some call it a utopia. Others call it soft tyranny. Historians still argue whether the Mita system was benevolent communal labor or cleverly disguised imperial exploitation. You're too tired to argue. You just want a bath. After several months, you're rotated out. Your replacement shows up looking fresh, smug, and unaware of the blister situation awaiting them. You return to your village with a slight limp and the deep, smug satisfaction of having survived another term of service. Your neighbors throw you a small welcome feast roasted guinea pig, chicha, and music played on flutes, carved from condor bone. You're asleep by the second song, face down in a bowl of mashed oca. Not long after, you're summoned again, but this time to build something different, a temple. You arrive at the construction site and stop dead in your tracks. This isn't just any temple. This is a new Ushnu, a sacred stepped platform from which ceremonies will be conducted, sacrifices offered, and authority declared. You're not just laying stones now. You're shaping belief. The priest in charge is terrifying. His face is painted. His robe swishes when he walks like it's made of storm clouds. He doesn't shout, but somehow his whispers are worse. You obey every instruction, even the ones that make no architectural sense. The altar must face the spirit wind. Whatever that means. You stack rocks until your hands are numb. You smear mortar made from ash and llama fat, and at night, you sleep beside the half-finished altar, praying that none of the mountain gods show up to critique your craftsmanship. One afternoon, a delegation arrives to dedicate the nearly finished site. They come bearing gifts, woven tunics, clay effigies, even a live jaguar that looks both drugged and extremely judgmental. There's music. There's smoke. There's a man walking in slow circles, muttering things to the sky, while holding a very confused chicken. As the ceremony reaches its peak, a young girl steps forward to offer a bundle of coca leaves and colored wool. She's trembling. You recognize the fear. You felt it too. Standing on these steps, feeling the weight of something older than yourself pressing down. The priest lifts his arms. The crowd falls silent. The wind, uncannily on cue, kicks up a swirl of dust. You swear you see something move in the smoke. You blink. It's gone. That night, no one speaks above a whisper. The temple isn't finished yet, but already the air feels thicker around it, as if it's drawing in energy like a mouth slowly opening. You return to your village and find things changed. Someone died while you were gone. A baby was born. A neighbor ran off with a trader from the coast. Life, in its stubborn rhythm, continues. Your brother is preparing for his mitta. He's been assigned to build part of the Cupac Yan, the Great Inca Road. You help him pack sandals, a flask for chicha, a tiny pouch of coca leaves, and a woven charm for protection. He asks you what it's like to work for the state. You think for a long time, then you tell him the truth. It's hard, but it works, and it never stops moving. He nods. You clasp forearms, a gesture of strength, and watch him disappear into the morning fog like so many before him. And somewhere, far above the valley, another set of feet begins to carve stone. Another road begins. Another terrace rises. Another chord is knotted. And the empire hums on. Your feet hit stone. Stone. More stone. You've been walking for 3 days now, chewing coca leaves to keep the altitude headache at bay, and muttering curses at whoever decided to build roads straight into the sky. The Cupac Yan, the Great Inca Road, is a marvel. Sure, but right now, your legs are on strike. Your back is twitching like a plucked harp string, and your respect for Inca engineers has taken on a slightly resentful tone. Still, you admit it. It's beautiful. The road clings to cliffs like a silver thread sewn into the mountains, sometimes just wide enough for 2 people to pass shoulder to shoulder. Llamas grunt behind you, their hooves clicking on the smooth flagstones. Ahead, a chasqui bursts from a bend in the trail and vanishes over a rope bridge. So fast, he leaves dust hanging in the air like a ghost. And there's that view, green valleys far below, clouds spilling over ridges like steam from a cosmic kettle. The road network is what ties the empire together. Some say over 24. Oh, 0 miles of it, stretching from sea to jungle to highland snow. You've crossed parts of it before, but never like this, never for this long. This deep. This time, you've been called to accompany an official inspection party. You're not sure what qualifies you, other than being available and not visibly limping that day. At every stop, Tambos, the rest stations, there's food and fire waiting. Nothing fancy, just dried meat, maize cakes, and the occasional slightly too warm gourd of chicha. But it's free. Expected. The empire takes care of its travelers. This, too, is power. Not just swords and armies, but comfort, predictability, knowing there will be a roof when the rain hits and a bowl when your stomach growls. At one-way station, you meet a woman who manages the supplies. She's sharp, quicker than the scribes who follow the inspector around. She knows the stock of every warehouse by heart and can read the quipu strings like they're bedtime stories. She laughs when you ask how. Knots don't lee, she says, tying one in your sleeve as a joke. People do. You leave before dawn the next morning. Your shoulders sore, but your mind buzzing. These roads, they don't just move people. They move trust. The state doesn't rule by brute force. It rules by showing up, by making sure the road's passable. The tambos are full, and the sun god is satisfied. It's a machine and you. like it or not, are a cog in it. Sometimes, the road forks into jungle thick, humid, and filled with the kinds of insects that think human ears are snack trays. You march past hot springs, rivers, and tiny villages perched on stilts. The architecture changes. The accents shift. The food tastes sweeter here. You're still in the empire, but just barely. The boundaries feel softer. The people smile, but don't always bow. Some refuse to speak Quechua. One man openly spits when the inspector's back is turned. The scribe catches it, writes it down. No one says anything. On the coast, the terrain flattens into desert. Here, the road becomes wider, straighter, flanked by dry hills and carved canals. You meet fishermen who still speak their own language, descendants of the Chimu, an empire swallowed by the Inca not long ago. They offer you ceviche, made from raw river fish. And it's so good, you almost forget you're far from home. They're polite, respectful, but you can feel it. The memory of conquest still simmers in the sand here. You ask about Chan Chan, the Chimu capital. A trader tells you it's still standing massive walls, labyrinthine corridors, old gods carved into adobe, but now under Inca control. We kept the city, he says with a shrug. But they took the power. He doesn't sound bitter, just tired. The inspector is taking notes on everything. The water levels in reservoirs, the placement of military outposts, the efficiency of harvest transport. He's the eyes and ears of the Sapa Inca. And you begin to realize how vast this surveillance network is. Not in the shadowy modern sense, but in the deeply human sense. People watching people. Neighbors reporting on neighbors. Quipu cords recording who contributed wool and who didn't. You begin to dream in knots. At one checkpoint, you see something you'll never forget. A suspension bridge made entirely of woven grass. It stretches across a canyon so deep it swallows sound. You're told it's rebuilt every year by local communities in a ritual that blends engineering with prayer. One man calls it a living thing, a kind of breathing architecture. You step onto it slowly, gripping the ropes, trying not to think about gravity. The bridge sways. The wind howls. But you make it across. Your heart doesn't stop racing until 2 tombos later. Back in the mountains, you help repair a section of road damaged by a rock slide. It's thankless work. But essentiel. Every traveler thanks you. A priest offers a blessing. A llama nearly kicks you in the knee. Balance. As always. And then, one day, you return to Cusco. You see the city differently now. The roads have changed you. You know the curve of every ridge, the weight of travel, the hum of empire that pulses beneath each cobblestone. You're part of it now in a way that ink can't capture. You've seen the fringes, the broken places, the stitched seams that hold it all together. The Sapa Inca holds a ceremony to celebrate road repairs. Yes, really. There's music, dancing, and a reenactment of bridge building that involves surprisingly enthusiastic children and one extremely grumpy alpaca. The emperor gives a speech about unity and the strength of connection. People cheer. You do too. Later that night, you lie on your mat and stare at the ceiling, thinking about the miles you've walked, the altitudes you've climbed, the people you've met. You remember the woman who reads knots like poetry, the jungle child who'd never heard of Cusco, the trader who spoke of lost cities and silence. You close your eyes, and you see the road. Endless, stone-lined, carved into cliffs. It leads everywhere. To faith, to labor, to order, to rebellion. It leads home. And still, beneath all that stone, something ancient stirs waiting. You don't get to rest for long. One morning, while trying to enjoy a bowl of toasted maize and the luxury of not walking uphill, a messenger arrives with the look of someone who's memorized every stone between here and Lake Titicaca. He announces that you've been selected for another imperial rotation, this time not to haul stones or trek roads, but to serve in the fields. You groan. Naturally. Then, you notice the others being summoned alongside you, potters, weavers, scribes. This isn't just labor, it's organized labor. It's the Mida again. Yes, but now you're seeing its full scope. You travel with your work group into the sacred valley. It's appropriately named green, lush, flanked by cliffs that look like they were carved by sun gods, showing off. The fields are geometric, sprawling across the valley floor and up terraces like leafy staircases to the sky. This is no small-scale farming. This is agriculture turned into imperial choreography. Every plot has its purpose. Some are state-owned, some are reserved for the temples, some are community-managed. You're assigned to all of them. Your supervisor is an older man, with a voice like gravel, and an eyebrow permanently arched in judgment. He shows you how to plant maize in evenly spaced rows, how to rotate potato varieties, and how to bury the occasional offering coca leaves, chicha, or a little carved llama, to ensure good yields. The apis don't like to be forgotten, he mutters, pressing a handful of herbs into the soil with his gnarled fingers. The Inca believe farming is a sacred task. The soil isn't just dirt, it's Pachamama, the Earth Mother, a living force who must be nourished and respected. When you dig, you do it gently. When you harvest, you thank her aloud. You start to believe the plants grow better when you sing to them. Or maybe you're just becoming your great aunt. Still, it's not all prayer and potato cuddling. There's strategy here. You're helping build Andean resilience. Whether you know it or not, crops are diversified maize here, quinoa there, tubers everywhere. The altitude is used like a zoning plan, lower fields for sweet corn, upper slopes for hardy potatoes. You even help maintain Cocha's artificial ponds that store water and feed terraced plots during dry spells. The whole thing is absurdly efficient. Every week, a team from Cusco arrives to inspect the progress. They count sacks, measure plots, consult with a Quipucamayoc, who knots furiously beside a field like he's in an angry knitting competition. You ask him how they store all the food. He points to a cluster of round, stone structures on a nearby hilltop, the Colcas, state granaries. Inside, freeze-dried chuño is stacked in tidy towers, flanked by dried fish, beans, and even llama jerky. Nothing goes to waste. It's famine insurance, war rations, and taxation all in one. Your role expands. After a month of planting, you're sent to assist the herders, the llamas. Naturally, ignore you. The alpacas warm to you slightly after you bribe them with salt. You learn to spin wool, to clean it, to dye it, using crushed insects and plants you've never noticed before. It smells terrible. It looks incredible. And, suddenly, you're more useful than you ever imagined with your own little belt of tools. Your hands dyed green-blue, and your name finally remembered by the foreman On your one day off each week, you sit near the irrigation channel and listen to the elders tell stories. One claims the Incas discovered over 200 varieties of potatoes. Another swears the emperor himself once transformed into a condor to inspect his fields. You're not sure which part of the story is meant to be true. Maybe both. Historians still argue whether the vast agricultural innovations of the Inca were driven by experimentation, inherited tradition, or a spiritual understanding of nature that's hard to quantify. You stop questioning it. Instead, you eat a new kind of tuber every few days. Each one with its own name, its own personality. There's a tiny one that tastes like dirt and regret, and a giant purple one that makes your mouth go slightly numb. Medicinal. Someone says, delicious. Someone else adds, you nod and eat more. Because there are worse things than purple numbness. Then one day, the supervisors call a halt. You gather near the central field. Someone has arrived from the capital. It's not a soldier. Not a priest. It's a researcher. Sort of. A figure wrapped in layers, carrying strange tools, and accompanied by an entourage of assistants carrying samples, drawings, and, weirdly, several jars of preserved insects. They're here to study vertical ecology. You blink. The what now? They explain, the Inca have mastered the vertical world. Different crops grow at different elevations, different animals, weather patterns. Even diseases thrive, depending on the altitude. So the empire is like a living laboratory, and your valley, with its stacked terraces and changing climates, is one of the finest examples. You try to look impressed, but you're mostly thinking about whether this means you get another break. Apparently not. Instead, you're recruited to help log data for the researchers. They explain how rainfall is measured, how seed varieties are tracked, and how even microclimates are mapped using tools carved from bone and bronze. One assistant teaches you to recognize fungal blights. Another teaches you how to predict a drought using the blooming of a particular cactus flower. This is not superstition. This is Inca science coded in symbols, passed through oral tradition, and recorded without writing. Yet, frighteningly accurate. After 2 moons, your mid-ends, you return to your home with stronger hands, thicker calves, and more knowledge than you ever expected to acquire from what began as a glorified farming rotation. You bring home a new tunic, woven with a maze pattern that says, I worked, I learned, I didn't collapse. Back in your village, people ask questions. You answer with stories about terraces that breathe, llamas that listen, and soil that remembers. Your neighbor asks if it's true that some fields are farmed just for the gods. You nod. They're planted, blessed, and harvested, but the food isn't eaten. It's offered. He frowns. Seems wasteful. You smile. Seems respectful. He shrugs. That night, you both drink chicha under the stars. Weeks later, you pass by one of the imperial storehouses on your way to market. You glance inside rows of food, wool, weapons. You realize that even though you're done with the fields for now, part of you is still in them. Literally, the work you did is stored here, guarded, measured, preserved. It's not just food, it's stability. Empire assurance. A quiet bet against chaos. You walk on, feeling the weight of it behind you. The harvest hums in the background, The terraces hold their shape, and above them all, the mountains watch, patient, eternal, and possibly amused. The sky hangs low over Cusco this morning, gray and heavy, like an old alpaca blanket that's been left out in the rain. You feel it in your bones. Something's shifting. Not just the weather. The whole city seems tense, bracing for the ripple of something enormous. And then, like a gust of wind slamming a door, it arrives, a new name spoken on every lip, echoing through temples and kitchens like a thunderclap. Pachacuti is dead. The earth-shaker, the great builder, reformer, architect of the empire is gone. His body, yes, but not his presence. No one says it outright. But you know, this isn't the end of an era. It's a handoff. And the empire doesn't pause to mourn, not when there's expansion to finish, provinces to manage, and heirs to prove themselves. You expect chaos. But instead, everything flows like it's already been planned for decades. The next ruler, his son, is Tupac Inca Yupanqui. You remember him from ceremonies. Tall, sharp-eyed, the kind of man who never forgets your name or your excuses. He's more than a prince now. He's the Sapa Inca, and the gold fringe on his royal tunic looks heavier than usual. You hear whispers that he's different from his father, less about foundations and more about horizons. If Pachacuti built the empire's bones, Tupac Inca wants to see how far the limbs can stretch. You're summoned for a new midda. And this time, it's not roads or terraces, it's conquest. Don't worry. You're not a soldier. Not really. You're part of the logistical crew. You manage llamas, haul supplies, and make sure the warriors don't run out of food or sandals. Still, you're marching with an army now south toward the lands of the Quilla, then west toward the Chimu, then farther than you ever thought this empire could go. The Inca military isn't flashy. It's efficient, well-fed, well-trained, and organized by decimals units of 10, 50, ehunal, 1,000 each, led by someone with an overly dramatic feathered headdress and a penchant for pep talks. Weapons include bronze-tipped spears, slingshots, capable of cracking skulls, and clubs that double as cooking tools in a pinch. But the real weapon order: every soldier has a place. Every plan has a backup. Before battles, the priests consult omens, flights of birds, the way coca leaves fall, dreams involving jaguars wearing boots. You're skeptical. Then you watch them correctly predict a storm and route the army around a flooded pass. You shut up about the jaguar boots. You arrive at the edge of Chimu territory, where the city of Chan Chan sits like a mirage, vast, silent, and made entirely of sand-colored walls. It's not Cusco. It's older, flatter, weirder. The Chimu Empire ruled here long before the Inca showed up, and their architecture feels like something grown rather than built. You walk through its labyrinthine alleys, tracing fish motifs carved into adobe, and wonder what it's like to live under the shadow of something this ancient. But time waits for no one. The Inca absorbed the Chimu like ink soaking into cloth, not by pure force though battles are fought, but by cutting off access to water. A strategic damming of canals chokes the city's life until it bows. Tupac Inca enters not with fire, but with ceremony. The Chimu rulers are absorbed, their gods accommodated, their artisans packed off to Cusco to add their brilliance to imperial temples. You meet one such artisan, a man who carves tiny birds from gold and doesn't speak unless absolutely necessary. He shows you a pair of earrings shaped like flying fish and shrugs when you ask how he did it. Practice, he says, and a steady hand. You feel very inadequate and quietly resolve to never attempt metalwork. The conquests continue. The Inca push north into Ecuador, where new dialects confuse your Quechua, and the locals don't care for Cusco's grand promises. They resist, fiercely, but the army adapts, builds forts, integrates new allies. You begin to understand the strange rhythm of conquest violence, followed by diplomacy. Swords, followed by feasts. One day you're repairing a suspension bridge. The next, you're translating trade agreements over roasted yams. But it's not just about land. It's about identity. New provinces are taught imperial ways, Quechua lessons, sun worship, new calendars, new tax obligations. The Inca don't erase, they overwrite. You help distribute new tunics, marked with imperial symbols. One old woman accepts hers with a grunt, then turns it inside out before putting it on. You pretend not to notice. You return to Cusco after nearly a year on campaign. The city has changed. More people, more temples, more noise. Markets now sell goods from the far north: peanuts, tropical fruit, clay whistles shaped like armadillos. You visit the Temple of the Sun and see new statues lining the hall. Tributes from conquered lands. Some look reverent. Some look confused. All are polished to perfection. Tupac Inca is celebrated as a hero. Poems are sung in his honor. You attend one festival where dancers reenact his victories using exaggerated movements, animal masks, and jokes about coastal warriors not liking cold weather. You laugh, but part of you wonders what the real story felt like on the other side. There are rumors that Tupac Inca sailed west on a great expedition with balsa rafts, exploring islands no one else has seen, that he returned with strange birds, gold from unknown shores, and tales of waters that stretch forever. Historians still argue whether this voyage happened or was simply an ambitious fish story, but you're inclined to believe it. He's that kind of man, one who refuses to color inside the borders of his own empire when he dies. You're older, wiser, tired. His mummy, of course, is preserved, blessed, and installed with the others in a grand ceremony that involves so many flowers, it looks like the jungle moved in for the weekend. His son, Huayna Capac, becomes emperor, and the empire doesn't flinch. Not yet. You feel the pulse of it still. In the roads, the bridges, the markets, the way even conquered regions now send tribute voluntarily, not out of fear, but because the system works. There are no coins, but there's currency in trust, in routine, in harvests that don't fail, in roads that don't collapse, in rulers who promise order and mostly deliver. But you also feel something else now. Attention. The empire has reached its maximum size, from Chilean deserts to Ecuadorian jungles. It spawned climats, languages, customs. Unity stretches thin. Rebellions spark like static. You wonder how long something this vast can hold before the seams begin to fray. Still, tonight you sleep under the stars, near the fortress of Ollantaytambo. Belly full, head spinning from too much chicha. The wind whistles through the stones like it knows secrets you don't. You dream of ships on western seas, of desert cities turned silent, of roads that wind home but never quite return. You don't want to open your eyes at first. The wind sounds different this morning. Low. Distant. Like something pacing the ridges beyond the fortress walls. You sit up on your straw mat and stretch. Bones creaking like old steps. You're in Ollantaytambo, a fortress carved from the mountain itself, where the terraces seem to cling to the cliff face by sheer will and excellent engineering. Behind you, massive stone blocks lock into place so tightly you still can't fit a knife blade between them. In front of you, a valley that opens toward the jungle. Green. Misty. And if the rumors are true, just shy of the empire's edge. Except now the edge keeps moving. Huayna Capac is emperor now. And the empire, somehow, is still growing. He's different from his father and grandfather, less a conqueror, more a curator. He doesn't just want new land. He wants new information, new plants, new animals, new climate zones to map and control. And with that desire comes expansion into increasingly difficult terrain, the Amazon's edge, the high northern Sierra, the frost-bitten peaks beyond what even llamas enjoy. You've been sent as part of a logistical caravan to support a northern push. You pack light tools, rations, textiles, spare sandals, and start walking. The Quapacyan guides your steps. But the path is rougher here. More slips. More landslides. More locals who eye you with a quiet mixture of curiosity and polite hostility. In the town of Quito, up in the future Ecuador, you find a landscape already touched by empire, but still humming with something different. The air smells of wet stone and strange fruit. The language is Quechua. Mostly, but laced with accents you can't follow. Your job is to assist in building a new storage center. But you spend most of your time trying to keep the mules from biting one another. You hear that Huayna Capac himself passed through this region just weeks earlier. People still speak about it. How he arrived in a procession longer than the town's main road. How his gold-decorated litter gleamed in the rain. How even the local leaders bowed low, despite their resistance. You wonder what he thought when he looked out at the hills here. Did he see empire, or did he see something slipping just out of reach? You're beginning to see at the limits. The cracks. The logistics are stretched thin. Some storehouses aren't restocked on time. Some tambo posts are understaffed. There are whispers that a village 2 days north stopped participating in MITA altogether, refusing to send laborers or taxes. No one says rebellion. Not yet. But it smells like dry grass just before the spark. Still, Huayna Capac is popular. He's led successful campaigns. He's improved the road system even further, extended the Quipu record-keeping to new bureaucratic heights, and brought more regions into the empire than anyone thought possible. He's even ordered the construction of new administrative centers in the north, including Tumebamba, a city modeled after Cusco, complete with temples, plazas, and sun-shaped flourishes carved into every lintel. You're sent to Tumebamba to help train locals in imperial protocols. You teach new recruits how to stack supplies in kolkas, how to interpret Quipu basics, how to file proper records, even though technically there's still no writing system. The training is uneven. Some understand. Some nod and ignore you. Some bribe the Quipukamayak when they think no one's watching. Then, without warning, it happens. Huayna Capac falls ill. You're not there to see it. He's deep in the north at the time, but the message spreads faster than you'd believe possible. first as a rumor, then as a fact. The Sapa Inca, son of the sun, ruler of the four quarters, is bedridden with fever. Some say it's from the jungle. Others blame the gods. One man swears it's divine punishment for expanding too far into lands not meant to be tamed. Historians still argue whether it was smallpox, typhus, or something else entirely. Introduced by unseen strangers from far away, no one yet knows about the Europeans. Not really. But something's come ashore, and it kills without introductions. You return to Cusco, just in time for the funeral rites. Except there's a problem. Tucsones, Atahualpa, raised in the north among warriors and generals. Huash God, born in Cusco, closer to the noble bloodlines. More at home in temples than on battlefields. Both have claims. Both have support. And neither seems interested in compromise. You watch from the sidelines as factions begin to form. Nobles whisper in corners. Priests hedge their blessings. Messengers arrive breathless from distant towns, reporting small fights and scuffles. You help maintain the roads, but you know what they're really being used for. Now troop movements. Atahualpa holds the north strong, seasoned, surrounded by generals. Huascar holds the capital holy, historical, entrenched in tradition. The civil war begins not with a bang, but a slow burn. At first, you think it might be short, a misunderstanding, a quick show of power. Then you see the casualties arrive. Broken spears, torn tunics, eyes wide from the shock of fighting brothers. Entire villages picked apart by conflicting taxes, conscripted twice, starved between loyalties. You help bury the dead. No songs, no processions, just silence and hurried prayers. The roads you once walked with pride now echo with boots and blood. The tambos once filled with travelers now serve as infirmaries or supply depots. The Quipuca Mayocs tie knots no one wants to count anymore. The empire isn't just fighting itself, it's tearing its logic apart. You pass an old friend near a checkpoint. He once trained llamas for state caravans. Now he's wearing a dented helmet and carrying a spear. He looks older, worn thin. He shrugs when you ask whose side he's on. The losing one, he says. Whichever that is. The fighting drags on for years. You try to stay useful, try to remain neutral. But neutrality is a fiction in a world that demands allegiance. When Atahualpa finally defeats Huascar, the empire is bruised, gasping, but still standing. Barely, you watch his procession enter Cusco. Ragged, but victorious. His soldiers chant. The nobles nod. Thin-lipped. The temples echo with uneasy silence. And then, as if the gods themselves waited for the perfect moment, 2 word spreads of strangers on the coast, tall men, pale skin, bearded faces, metal clothes, animals with hooves that shake the ground, and something worse, disease. The same sickness that took Huayna Capac, now spreading like fire. Villages disappear in days. People die in silence. Too weak to burn the bodies. You help dig graves, then dig more. Then stop counting. You remember the time you helped build a shrine. You remember feeding maize to the sun, weaving cloth with holy symbols, planting terraces with care and song. And now you light a fire beside the road and whisper prayers to Inti, not for empire, not for victory, but simply for survival. Somewhere out there, The world is changing, and it's galloping toward you at terrifying speed. The hooves are the first thing you hear. You're gathering water from a stream near your village when the ground starts to tremble. Not an earthquake, not a herd of llamas, but something heavier, louder, rhythmic. You rise slowly, hands dripping, and peer down the trail. They're not gods, not demons, just men. But unlike any men you've seen, they're on beasts, animals, too tall to be alpacas, too fast to be anything natural. Horses. You don't have a word for them yet. To you, they're monsters with hooves and heads like angry statues. Eyes wide. Breath steaming in the morning, chill. The men on their backs wear metal, not cloth. Their faces are covered in stubble. Their cloaks reek of sweat and smoke, and their language sounds like coughing through gravel. One of them raises a hand, not in greeting, but as command, and suddenly, you're frozen. These are the Spaniards. You've heard rumors. Traders from the coast spoke of ships larger than temples, of sticks that shoot fire, of diseases that melt lungs. And now, those same pale faces have arrived inland, unannounced and seemingly unimpressed by your empire. They call themselves Christians, speak of a king across the sea, and carry banners with symbols that don't match any waka or temple pattern you know. They stare at your gold earrings, not with reverence, but with hunger. Atahualpa, now emperor after the long, bitter civil war, is aware. He's stationed in the north in Cajamarca, receiving reports, playing a cautious game. You're not close to the court, but the gossip spreads quickly. He knows about the Spaniards. He's watching, waiting. You, on the other hand, are pressed into service again. This time, not mita, not agriculture, not even var. You're translating, well, trying to. You and a handful of others are tasked with helping the Spaniards navigate, negociate, and maybe stall. You don't speak Spanish. They don't speak Quechua, but someone among them, an interpreter named Felipillo, knows just enough to be dangerous. He translates in bursts, gestures wildly, often looks confused. You've no idea if anything you say reaches the Spaniards with its original meaning intact. It's like playing telephone with ghosts. But the Spaniards aren't just here to talk. They march to Cajamarca and send a message to Atahualpa. Come meet us. Atahualpa, confident in his power, his army, and his divine status, agrees. He arrives in a royal litter, surrounded by thousands of attendants, musicians, and warriors. You're not there in person, but the story spreads like fire, and it burns. The meeting is a trap. Francisco Pizarro, the Spaniard in charge, sets an ambush. Atahualpa enters the plaza, unarmed, regal. A priest steps forward and hands him a book, a Bible. He opens it, hears nothing, sees nothing, tosses it aside. He doesn't understand. The priest shouts. The Spaniards attack. What follows isn't a battle. It's a slaughter. Guns explode. Horses trample. Swords slice through cloth, and flesh like smoke through air. The Inca attendants are cut down in heaps. The emperor, your emperor, is seized. Taken prisoner. His royal litter is dropped. His dignity crashes with it. You hear the details in whispers. Atahualpa is held in a room, told to fill it with gold and silver in exchange for his freedom. So he does. Couriers are dispatched. Gold is stripped from temples, melted into bars, carried in caravans over mountains. You help haul one. It's heavy, warm from the sun, and you hate it. This isn't tribute. It's theft in slow motion. The room fills. The Spaniards smile. And then they kill him anyway. They claim it's justice. Say he plotted against them. That he refused to accept their God. That he clung to his old ways. You watch as they baptize him before his execution. As if water from a stranger's hand can erase centuries of solar divinity. He dies. Not in battle, not as a god, but as a man bound, betrayed. And far from the capital that once praised him, you weep that night. Not because you loved him, but because something bigger than him died too. The illusion of control, the idea that your world made sense. The Spaniards march south after that. Faster now. The roads you helped build carry them. The storehouses you stocked feed them. The empire, your empire, unwittingly becomes the tool of its own undoing. Cusco falls, quietly, without the great battle everyone expected. The nobility flees. The temples are looted. The mummies of dead emperors are burned. Burned, as if they were just bundles of old clothes and not the sacred remnants of generations. You wander the city in silence. The gold has been stripped from the Coricancha. The Sun Temple is bare. A church foundation is already being laid beside it. One culture being built atop another. Stone on stone. Like a joke. No one asked for. There are still pockets of resistance. General Rumanyawi, in the north, burns Quito to keep it from the Spaniards. Manco Inca Yupanqui, a royal relative, briefly cooperates with the invaders, then realizes the lie and flees. You hear he's gathering warriors in the Vilcabamba region. A last stand, a ghost kingdom forming in the jungle. You consider joining. Maybe you still will, but for now, you work quietly. You watch. You carry. You survive. The Spanish language starts to bleed into daily speech. Their horses trample sacred trails. Their priests condemn your rituals. You hide your coca leaves. Whisper your prayers at night. And pass on your stories in lullabies. Hoping the children will remember what the records no longer hold. One day, you find a quipu buried behind a collapsed tambo. It's knotted, faded, half-rotted. You don't know what it says. You press it to your heart anyway, because it's a thread, and you need something to hold on to. The empire may be broken, but its people still breathe, and the wind still hums through the valleys in Quechua. The air in Vilcabamba smells different, wetter, greener, like every tree and stone is watching you, waiting to see what you'll do next. You made it barely through forests, so dense they swallowed sunlight. Across rivers with names that only the oldest songs remember. You fled when the Spaniards took Cusco, with nothing but a woven bag of dried potatoes and your mother's carved amulet. You weren't the only one. Hundreds flee. Thousands. Maybe. A trickle at first. Then a flood of weary feet moving west into the jungle, hoping the empire's bones still held some marrow. This is where the Inca fight back, not in broad daylight, not on the fields of Cusco, but in the deep green wild. Welcome to the Neo-Inca state, the last ember of an empire, flickering in the shadows. Manco Inca Yupanqui is here. You see him once, at a distance, riding a mule through a clearing, face half covered in jungle dust. He wasn't supposed to be a rebel. At first, he tried to work with the Spaniards. They propped him up as a puppet emperor after Atahualpa's death, hoping he'd calm the nobles and keep the roads running. But when they disrespected his lineage, desecrated the temples, and imprisoned his family, he turned hard. Now he's not their pawn. He's their problem. You work in one of the support camps digging terraces, storing grain, teaching children how to whisper the old prayers. No one wears gold anymore. It's too dangerous. The Spanish took enough to pave roads to their gods. Now you carry your faith in seeds, songs, and memory. The jungle protects you. Sort of. The trees are thick. Yes. The river's unpredictable. But disease doesn't care about loyalties. Fever sweeps the camp in waves. Some say the Spaniards left curses behind. Others say, the gods are testing you. You chew coca leaves until your tongue numbs and dream of mountains wrapped in fire. The Spanish try to find you. You hear them. Sometimes muskets cracking in the distance. Horses snorting at vines. They come, but they don't always return. This land doesn't welcome metal. It swallows noise. Here, spears and silence are sharper than guns. Manco's warriors strike from the shadows. Guerrilla attacks. Ambushes. Sabotage. They know the trails. They know the rains. They disappear before anyone can even say Inca. One night, word arrives that they've retaken Ollantaytambo. You smile. You remember laying those stones. Those terraces. Now they're shields. Walls. Proof the past still has teeth. But it doesn't last. The Spaniards regroup. They bring more soldiers. More guns. More diseases. The rebellion stumbles. Then retreats. Ollantaytambo falls again. Manco flees deeper into the jungle, building a new capital. Vitca's first. Then Vilcabamba itself. A ghost city hidden in vines and smoke. It becomes a myth even while it's still alive. You help build defenses, hidden trails, camouflaged camps, signal fires. You braid hair with coded patterns, messages in strands. You whisper news down the mountainside in riddles. Your language survives, not through books, but through weaving, music, and lies. You live like this for years, always listening, always watching. Children are born in hiding. Ancestors are buried in silence. You celebrate Inti Raymi in secret, turning bowls toward the sun and pretending not to cry when you hear a Spanish priest chant over a converted temple somewhere far away. Some of the refugees speak of mestizos, people born from both worlds, straddling the line between conquest and memory. Some of them are allies. Others bring danger. You trust no one without calloused hands and old songs in their breath. One year, a visiting runner brings word from the Andes. The Spanish have declared the old gods dead. They've renamed your towns. They've built churches atop every sun temple they could find. But still, he says, people remember. In markets, they speak Quechua under their breath. In songs, they smuggle the names of ancient gods. In festivals, they wear masks that look suspiciously like old spirits, resurrected for a dance. Your rebellion is more than swords now. It's survival through subversion. Then, like a mountain crumbling in silence, news arrives. Manco Inca is dead, murdered by traitors. You freeze. When you hear it, your knife half buried in a pile of coca leaves. You drop it. No one moves. No trumpet blows. No bells ring. Just the hush of disbelief, followed by the slow, careful business of continuing. His sons take over. First, Sayri Tupac. He makes peace with the Spaniards. Even moves to Cusco briefly. Some call him a coward. Others call him wise. But you feel it a soft sigh in the jungle. A loosening of something tight. Then Titu Cusi. He returns to Vilcabamba. Tries to negotiate. Keep the old flame alive. He converts to Christianity, but not fully. Not sincerely. You hear he still leaves offerings under the moon. When he dies, the last Inca rises. Tupats Amaru. He doesn't want war, but war comes anyway. The Spaniards, determined to snuff out the ember once and for all, march into Vilcabamba in 1572. They find only traps and ghosts. You're long gone by then, hiding deeper in the cloud forest, with nothing but a spindle, a bag of potatoes, and a half-finished story in your head. They capture him, parade him through Cusco, execute him in the square where his ancestors once ruled. They say the city watched in silence. They say the sun refused to shine that day. Historians still argue whether it was overcast or whether the gods simply looked away. It's over, officially, but as you sit beneath a canopy of humming insects and moss-covered branches, you feel something different. Not an end. A folding. A retreat into the roots. You know the empire lives on. Not in cities or palaces, but in the way you plant your maize, in the lullaby you hum to your daughter, in the path you walk barefoot each morning, where the stone remembers footsteps it hasn't felt in years. The Spaniards build their empire on top of yours, but yours is still humming beneath. And you are the hum. You walk through a market that smells like roasted maize, vetvol, and a little bit like rain that's still deciding whether to fall. It's not Cusco. Not anymore, at least. Not the Cusco you knew. Gone are the sun-drenched gold panels and the solemn processions to the Temple of the Sun. The great plaza still stands, but now it's flanked by the cold gray stone of Spanish churches, one of which squats right on top of the Coricancha, like a smug colonial hat. But the people, they're still here, and they're speaking Quechua. The empire is gone. Yes, the banners, the thrones, the formal declarations of divinity, but its bones remain. In the weaving patterns on a woman's shawl, in the rhythms of the Andean flute player, tucked between two stalls selling potatoes in 57 varieties, in the way the children recite stories not from books, but from breath, from memory, from the little cues hidden in a grandmother's smile. You've come back from the jungle, not to surrender, just to be, to blend in, to witness the next version of things. You're older now. Your joints creak louder than your sandals, but you know how to disappear in a crowd, how to say little and watch much. You see it all. The transformation, the resistance. Catholic festivals now dominate the calendar. But if you squint, they don't look all that different from Inti Raymi. The saints' processions feature musicians in devil masks that bear a suspicious resemblance to ancient Andean deities. Offerings left at church altars include coca leaves and maize alongside the candles. Even the Virgin Mary is sometimes dressed in robes that mimic Mama Quilla, the moon goddess, complete with silver threads and crescent earrings. They call it syncretism. You call it survival. The Spanish have divided the old lands into new viceroyalties. They tax the people, take the best land, and mine the hills for silver until the mountains groan. You try to avoid the mines, especially Potosi, a place spoken of in fearful tones. They say it devours lives, that for every ingot of silver, there are 10 ghosts melted into the rock. Your neighbors are pressed into service under a system that looks eerily familiar. It's still called Mita, but now it's crueler. Not seasonal community work for empire or God, but mandatory shifts in mines where the air is thin and the tunnels are narrower than your nightmares. Historians still argue whether this colonial version of Mita was a complete distortion of the original or simply a dark mirror held too close to the face of power. You take on quieter tasks, helping elders pass on weaving designs, showing children how to build terraces that won't collapse in the rainy season. Sometimes you serve as a guide for confused Europeans looking for lost temples. You point them toward the wrong hills. Oops, you find yourself thinking of the ancestors more and more. The mummies that once lined the city during festivals. You remember how they sat upright in cloaks, carried like elders rather than relics. The Spanish burned many of them, said it was necessary. But in villages tucked deep into the mountains, you still hear whispers that some survived, that some walk the dreams of the Quechua people even now. And there's the language. Oh, the language. Quechua doesn't just live, it blooms. It adapts, folds in new words, reshapes itself. The Spanish bring their vocabulary, and Quechua absorbs what it wants, spits out what it doesn't. You sit in a courtyard one evening and listen to a boy tell a story about Inti and the saints arguing over who gets to control the weather. Everyone laughs. The line between old and new has blurred so completely that no one remembers where it began. There are schools now, run by priests. You send your nephew, because literacy is power, even if the books are laced with bias. He reads the Bible in Spanish by candlelight, then helps you recite old songs by firelight. He walks in both worlds. You're not sure whether to be proud or afraid. Sometimes, you visit the hills alone. You stand in fields that were once ceremonial spaces. You pour a sip of chicha into the earth, just in case the apis are still listening. One time, a breeze answers you with a whisper, probably. Or maybe it was just the wind in a condor's wing. You help plant maize the old way, placing a small stone in each hole for luck. The younger ones tease you. You smile and keep digging. You know what the stone is for. It's not magic. It's memory. And then there's Machu Picchu. You go there once. In your older years, when your knees complain and your pack is too heavy, and you forget why you're even making the climb. But when you arrive, oh, it's still there, perched like a whisper between sky and stone. The clouds part just enough to show the terraces, the fountains, the temple of the sun, unlooted, untouched, as if it waited, as if it knew. You sit on a terrace and let the silence fold around you like a cloak. Birds call. Llamas chew lazily nearby. You feel the rhythm again, the breath of the empire. Not dead, but dreaming. Later, back in the village, someone asks you what it was like. You smile, like listening to a song you'd forgotten. But your bones remembered. Time pass. Empires rise and fall. The Spanish Empire itself will one day fracture, break, fade. But the Inca were never just palaces or emperors. They were systems, ideas, languages, textiles, stories. They hid in looms, in lullabies, in footsteps pressed into stone. They curled into the DNA of the Andes like seeds waiting for sun. And now, you see, young girls weaving ancient patterns into new tunics. You hear Quechua being spoken in the market between jokes about chicha prices. You watch the sacred dances continue under saint-shaped banners. Hips still swaying to rhythms carved in pre-conquest stone. The empire lives, not in conquest, but in continuity. You walk home under stars that once guided Pachacuti's gaze. Somewhere, deep in the mountains, the old roads still wind forward, and your feet still know the way. You dream in stone now, not just any stone, perfectly shaped and placed stones. Smooth as bone and silent as breath. You're back in Cusco. But not really. The city you walk through is layered, split between two hearts. One beats for Spain, the other for something older. Below the colonial arches, beneath the church bells, you feel the pulse of the Inca still thudding softly, like a drum under a blanket. You now work with your hands again, not as a laborer, but as a guide, a quiet one. Wealthy newcomers from distant lands come to see Inca ruins. They marvel at the architecture, gasp at the views, tilt their heads like curious birds at the ancient symbols etched into walls. You smile politely. You nod. When they mispronounce Pachacuti, you listen patiently when one of them tries to tell you what the Inca believed. But sometimes when no one's watching you, reach out and brush your fingers along the stone, and it's like touching time itself. Your tours begin early, the sun barely up. Shadows still stretched long, like sleepy cats across the plaza. You start with the Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun, now crowned with a church built during the viceroyalty. You tell them what's true, that once the walls were covered in gold, that the garden shimmered with metallic maize, that the sun rose each day and kissed the stones like a lover. You don't say that it still feels sacred to you. You don't have to. The air says it. They ask about the Inca worldview. You try to explain, not just gods in the sky, but spirits in every river, every bird, every rock. The world wasn't a thing to conquer. It was a partner. You gave. It gave back. Usually. Unless you were rude. In which case, yes, sometimes the weather was personal. They smile, thinking it's a joke. You move on to Sacsayhuaman, the fortress above the city. You lead them along its zigzagging walls, massive boulders bigger than your guide group's rented bus, fitted together without mortar. Shaped like thunder. That's learned geometry. They gasp. Ask how it was built. You shrug. Say muscle. Planning. Patience. You don't mention the theories. Alien conspiracies. Supernatural nonsense. Historians still argue whether it was pure engineering brilliance or something more. You know it was hands. Human ones. Just very tired ones. One guest asks what Sacsayhuaman means. You answer softly, satisfied hawk, and point to the sky, where one circles above, as if on cue. Back in the city, the blend continues. You pass a bakery selling pan de oro, golden bread, named for the temple's long-gone gold panels. You hear a radio play a tune in Quechua with a modern beat, the singer crooning love lyrics that sound a little like offerings. You smell wood smoke and eucalyptus and know someone nearby is preparing a ritual fire. Officially, it's for St. John. Unofficially, it's for the mountain spirit that lives in the ridge behind their house. Your own house is small, tucked in an alley where the cobblestones are original, cut by hands that may have been your great-great-great-great-grandmother's neighbors. You keep a bundle of coca leaves near the door, not for chewing, but for remembering, for placing at crossroads, for tucking into the folds of your coat when you climb too high and need your heart to calm. One afternoon, a stranger asks if you think the Inca were perfect. You laugh, loudly. No, no empire is perfect. You tell him how rigid the system was, how rebellion was punished, how labor was compulsory, even if it kept the roads and terraces pristine. You remember the mita, your sore back, the calluses that never quite faded, but you also tell him this: no civilization survives only in records. It survives in practice. And practice is messy. He nods, writes something in a notebook, then asks if you'd like to see a drone photo of Machu Picchu. You do. And it's stunning. There it is. The royal retreat in the sky, nestled among green peaks, terraces like stairs to nowhere, walls that still stand, still hold the light at just the right angle during the solstice. He shows you the alignments, sunrise through the temple window, the shadow that looks like a serpent, the mystery of why it was built there in the first place. You whisper the old name, Patalacta, the high place, the sacred step. Later, you walk through a village where the market is in full swing. Bright shawls, wooden flutas, potatoes piled in every color, imaginable red, gold, purple, blue. You see a young girl playing with a sling, whirling it above her head, eyes narrowed like a warrior in miniature. Her mother weaves nearby, her fingers moving without looking, creating a pattern that tells a story about the rainy season and a fox who tried to steal the moon. You stop at a stall selling figurines, little jammas, tiny warriors, and one made of clay, painted in fading gold of an Inca ruler with arms raised. You pick it up, not because you need it, but because it fits in your hand like something you've been missing without knowing. The vendor watches you. You remember. Don't you? She says. You nod. There are scholars now. Peruvian, foreign, Quechua-speaking, trying to reclaim the truth. Dig through centuries of Spanish reports, biased chronicles, and well-meaning nonsense. They piece together what they can. Some say the Inca were masters of statecraft. Others call them socialist visionaries. Some call them tyrants. You know this. They were people, complicated, ingenious, flawed, sacred. You're sitting near the Plaza de Armas one evening, sipping a warm drink made from purple corn and cinnamon, when a parade starts. Loud, colorful, slightly chaotic. A festival. You ask which one. No one quite knows. It's for a saint, or a mountain, or maybe just for fun. And there, in the crowd, you see a mask, a gold face with slanted eyes, a sun-shaped crown. A dancer spins, laughing. The people cheer. And just like that, the emperor walks again, maybe not on a throne, not with a litter of attendants and a golden staff, but through music, memory, movement. You close your eyes and smile. The empire never ended. It simply changed clothes. You've started walking the old roads again, not as a courier, or a builder, or even a guide, just as someone who needs to feel the stones under their feet, to remember the rhythm of the Quapac Yan in your bones. It's not nostalgia, exactly. It's something quieter, something like longing, but slower, more patient, like the sound of sandals on gravel at sunrise. The road from Cusco winds north into the Sacred Valley. You follow it with a pack of supplies, a walking stick carved with a sunburst, and a hand-woven pouch full of coca leaves gifted by a woman who claims they came from plants grown near the original royal nursery. You believe her. She had the kind of smile that makes lies taste like truth. The path climbs, 2 dips, curves between mountains, hugging slopes like a thread stitched by the hands of time. You pass terraces still in use, families tending to maize, potatoes, and the gentle gossip of earth. No tractors here, just human hands and the ghosts of Inca engineers whispering from beneath the soil. You reach Pisac after a day's walk. The ruins spill down the mountain like teeth, each temple and tomb perfectly aligned with the stars. You sit there for hours, watching the sun carve shadows across carved stone, and imagine what it once looked like when priests moved in ritual steps, when offerings steamed in the cold morning air, when time itself felt like it answered to the beat of a drum. A local boy watches you from behind a cactus. You wave. He waves back, then vanishes. Later, you find a line of stones shaped into a spiral left near your sleeping mat. A message. Maybe. A game. Or just the land saying hello. You continue on, up toward the highland lakes. Here, the air is thin enough to make your thoughts float. You find an old tambo site half collapsed, moss-covered, but still standing. You light a fire and stay the night. The silence wraps around you like wool. Somewhere far off, a pan flute plays. Or maybe it's just wind curling through hollow reeds. The next day, you pass a group of schoolchildren on a field trip, led by a teacher who looks like she'd rather be home with her chickens. But she pauses when she sees you, nods respectfully, and gestures to her students to make way. They part, chattering, and you hear one of them say, "Inca runaka rimaita yachani." That old man knows the speech of the Inca. You smile, because for once, being mistaken for someone ancient doesn't feel like an insult. In Ollantaytambo, you stop and sit on the stairs. You helped rebuild once. Long ago. They haven't changed. The stones haven't moved. The terraces are still farmed. You speak to a farmer who claims her family's been planting here since the time of Tupac Inca Yupanqui. You don't doubt her. The way she touches the soil, like it's a relative, tells you more than words ever could. She feeds you soup made from oca and quinoa, and tells you about the new mayor trying to rename all the neighborhoods with Spanish numbers. You ask her what she thinks. She just grins and says, "Let them count. We remember the names the stones do." At night, you dream again, this time of Pachacuti, standing at the edge of Machu Picchu. Arms raised, not in pride, but in awe. Behind him, the mountains curl like waves. Below, a sea of mist. He turns to you and asks, "Imaina Kanki, how are you?" You answer without words, because you're not just a pilgrim. You're a carrier of memory, of rhythm, of a story that never really needed paper. Your walk takes you farther, into communities most maps forget. In the shadow of Apurimac, you help a village dig an irrigation trench that follows the same curves as the old Inca canals. You show a child how to patch a wall with fitted stone instead of cement. The elders nod as you speak, not because they need your knowledge, but because they're glad someone remembers how to listen. In a high pasture near Vilcabamba, a woman offers you a sip of strong chicha and points toward a ridge. That's where the last Inca fled, she says, but not the end of the road. You sleep under that ridge. Stars blinking through tree branches. A fox calls. A drizzle taps your cloak. You whisper a prayer to Ilapa, the old thunder god, and half expect him to answer. He doesn't, but the clouds part just enough to show the moon. You descend the next day into a small town where someone's painted a mural on the side of a clinic. It shows an Inca emperor holding a stethoscope, a woman with a woven skirt giving medicine to a child. Beneath it, Kausaimanta Yachai Nikuta, Hamukunata Yachachi Manchik. Let us teach those who come after how to live. You stand there a long time. Later, in the plaza, someone hands you a flyer for a festival half Catholic, half not. There will be music, food, dancing. You decide to stay. As the sun sets, you sit with a plate of roasted corn and a wooden cup of sweet liquor. Someone pulls you up to dance. You stumble at first, then find the beat. It's an old rhythm, Inca rhythm, buried, but never lost. After the music ends, a teenage boy approaches. He's nervous, tugs at the edge of his tunic, which sports a modern print of Pachamama and a soccer ball. What was it like, he asks. Before. You think. It was hard. You say, but it was ours. He nods. Do you think it'll come back? You smile. It never left. He grins, disappears into the crowd, and you sit there, warmed by firelight. Listening to the drums continue long into the night. The road calls again, but for now, you stay, because the Inca never needed palaces to live. They just needed footsteps. And yours are still walking. You wake to bells. But they're not the soft chiming of sacred rituals echoing through a sun temple. They're louder, more impatient, calling people to mass. You're in Cusco again, but it feels like a borrowed version of itself. The city has grown busier, louder, its walls plastered with posters and announcements. Its ancient alleyways now humming with mopeds and footsteps from 100 nations. Still, in the early light, you find the stone. There it is. Right where it always was, the 12-angled stone, tucked into a wall that once held up the palace of an emperor. You touch it with your fingers, feeling the dips and edges like braille. And for a moment, the noise falls away. It's still perfect, fitted like time itself was softened and pressed into shape. A tour group passes behind you, their guide explaining the genius of Inca stonework. Some tourists nod. Others check their phones. One man looks at you, sees your hand on the stone, and whispers, "You must be local." You smile and say, "More than you know." You spend the day in the archives. Not dusty libraries, no. These are the living archives, the kitchens, the markets, the workshops, where memory hides in repetition. You help an old potter carve a double-spout vessel with a feline figure clinging to the rim. He tells you it's based on pieces found buried under a church foundation. They tried to erase us, he says, but we're good at hiding in plain sight. At a school on the outskirts of town, you teach a group of children about Chicana, the Andean cross. You draw it in the dirt. 3 steps stacked above 3. A stairway to the sky, the earth, and the underworld. You tell them how the center represents balance, all things in right relation. You say. A girl raises her hand and asks, "Even cell phones?" You laugh. Especially cell phones. You walk the plaza that night and catch a procession candles held high. Dancers with painted faces, flutes and drums, playing something older than any hymn. The saints' banners wave, but the feet know other steps. And you know what you're seeing, Takiankoi. The dance of resistance, hidden inside the celebration of the saints. The next morning, you travel south, along the old Inca Trail, toward Lake Titicaca. The bus is modern, but the road is not. Beneath every twist, every ridge, you sense the path laid centuries ago, paved by hands you once knew, shaped to follow the lines of the land, not conquer it. Puno greets you with chill wind and waves that lap like whispers. On the lake, you board a reed boat with a local family who still builds them. The old way, totora bundled tight and curved to catch both air and memory. They take you to a floating island made of thatch, where houses sway gently atop woven mats. You sip coca tea and listen to a woman sing in Aymara, her voice cutting through the mist like the memory of thunder. She asks you if the Inca ever reached this far. You nod, but not in the way a historian would. You nod because the empire wasn't just walls and roads. It was presence. Flow. You can feel it here in the way she lights her fire, in the small altar beside her cooking pot, in the way she watches the sun and murmurs thanks without needing a calendar. Later, in a town square beneath a stone archway, you find a boy selling souvenirs, tiny replicas of Inca kings. Miniature terraces, gold-painted figurines. One of them holds a quipu, made of thread, no thicker than a shoelace. You ask the boy who taught him to make it. "My grandfather," he says. He says it's not for counting anymore. It's for remembering. You buy one. It weighs almost nothing. In Arequipa, you meet a woman preserving Inca agricultural techniques on experimental terraces, testing how crops grow at different elevations. Just like in the sacred valleys. You help plant a row of oca. She explains that the empire's legacy isn't just historical, it's ecological. The terracing, the crop rotation, the water channels, they still work. Still feed people. Still protect the earth. You travel on, chasing echoes. In every village you pass, you find someone keeping time with the past. A weaver using old patterns to tell new stories. A musician carving flutes from cactus wood. Each note chasing the ghosts of Andean gods. A child tracing spiral patterns into wet sand with a stick and calling it the map of where my grandmother lives. Eventually, you return to Lima, a city of concrete and sea spray and noise. But here too, among the tangled streets and colonial churches, you find hints. A restaurant proudly serving quinoa and guinea pig. A muralist painting Inti above a skyline of satellite dishes. A university archive digitizing old Quechua songs, one of which, they admit, has no known source. You recognize it. You remember it from a night long ago. Zung under breath during a storm. The city is vast, modern, crowded, but beneath it all, the land breathes. It remembers what was here before. And so do you? You stop by the edge of the cliffs, watching the Pacific crash against the rocks far below. This is where the Spaniards first arrived, where ships brought steel, plague, and new names for old gods. You feel no anger now, just gravity, a sense of weight, of what was carried across centuries, and what was never lost, even when it seemed forgotten. A street musician plays a haunting tune on a panpipe. The wind catches the notes and scatters them like seeds. You think about the empire, not just the one that ruled, but the one that endured, the one that taught you that civilization is not defined by walls or armies, but by how you treat the land, by how you feed your people, by whether or not the children know the old songs. A woman walks past, holding a baby wrapped in a blanket with bright patterns. She hums softly, just loud enough for you to hear the shape of a melody you haven't heard in decades. You turn to look. She nods, and just like that, the story continues. The trail takes you into the clouds. Now literally, you're on the high spine of the Andes. Above 0 feet. Walking through patches of mist so thick, your hand vanishes if you stretch it too far ahead. The air here is thinner, and so are the stories, but both still carry echoes of the Inca. You can feel them every time your boot scuffs a smooth patch of stone, carved and placed 500 years ago by people who believed even the rocks could feel. You're following part of the Royal Road again, this time toward Choqquequirau, Cradle of Gold. They say, a sister city to Machu Picchu, but more remote, more reluctant to be known. Most tourists don't make the trip. Too steep, too hidden, too patient. But you go anyway, because you're not just chasing history now. You're walking with it. Your guide is a man named Elias. Wiry as rope and older than he looks. He doesn't speak much, unless it's to correct your foot placement or explain that a certain plant helps with altitude sickness, toothaches, and broken hearts. He's Quechua through and through. And as you make camp near a ruined tambo, he sings an old song that mentions Manco Inca, May's spirits, and something about a fox stealing the moon's reflection. You don't understand every word, but the cadence wraps around your ribs like a shawl. In the morning, you reach the city, if you can call it that. Choqquequirau isn't a place. It's a whisper etched in terraces. No golden thrones, no grand plazas teeming with tourists. Just the hum of insects, the flutter of condors overhead, and stone steps climbing in solemn zigzags toward the clouds. You find a carved llama on one of the terrace walls, outlined in white stone against gray. They say these were ritual symbols, offerings to the gods, or maybe just art. Historians still argue whether Choqquequirau was a final refuge of Inca nobility or a spiritual waypoint on the way to the afterlife. You sit beside the carving and wonder if the people who placed it ever thought anyone would be staring at it half a millennium later. Holding trail mix, the stillness is sacred. You don't speak. Elias doesn't either. Together you just sit. As the mountain breathes around you, afterward, you descend into lower lands, where jungle meets ridge and humidity sticks to your collar like regret. Here, the Inca roads vanish, more often swallowed by trees, broken by landslides, erased by time. But sometimes you find fragments, a staircase poking from the ferns, a piece of irrigation canal, stubbornly channeling water like it doesn't know it's been forgotten. You pass through a village that celebrates a festival you've never heard of. You ask what it's for, and an elder laughs. It's for everyone, and no one. It's just what we do. There's dancing, of course, and chicha, and music made from instruments carved with ancient patterns. Children wear masks, some of devils, some of gods. You see one that looks suspiciously like Viracocha. You raise an eyebrow. No one confirms or denies. The old stories haven't disappeared. They've just changed format. Some are TikToks now. Some are embroidered into backpacks. Some are taught in classrooms that still wobble between Spanish mandates and indigenous pride. You visit a school where the blackboard bears 3 words written in thick chalk: Amasua, Amalulla, Amaquilla. Don't steal. Don't lie. Don't be lazy. Still relevant. One teacher tells you they're developing a new curriculum that blends STEM with ancestral farming techniques. We teach them to code, she says. But we also teach them to listen to the mountains. She hands you a packet of quinoa, grown by her students. Each seed stored in hand-woven pouches for good luck. You carry it with you like treasure. In a small museum in Abancay, you meet a researcher scanning fragments of quipu into a digital archive. She shows you a color-enhanced thread, each knot encoded with numeric values, and maybe more. We think some of these weren't just ledgers. She says, they might be songs, or laws, or gossip. She laughs. Can you imagine an entire empire whispering itself into string? You can. You do. You sleep that night near a collapsed watchtower, wrapped in blankets that smell like smoke and eucalyptus. Above, the stars blaze so brightly, you have to squint. You whisper a thank you to the ancestors, to the runners who once passed this way, to the stonecutters who made roads for gods and grandmothers alike. Morning brings clarity. You pack your gear, lace your sandals, and continue walking not toward any specific site, but toward the idea of the Inca. You begin to realize that you've stopped distinguishing between ruins and living places. Every stone has something to say. Every trail knows a secret. You pass a boy leading a llama, humming a song that sounds like it hasn't been recorded anywhere. He pauses when he sees you and says, "My grandmother says these stones remember names." You nod. They do. He walks on, his llama blinking at you with casual contempt. As gemas though, the trail ends at a cliffside with a view that makes your breath catch. Valleys spill below in greens and grays, threaded with rivers, dotted with fields. You see the ghost of a terrace, the faint trace of an aqueduct, a stone wall curled into a forgotten fold of the land. The empire isn't gone. It's just been quiet. You sit down, eat a handful of dried fruit, and look out over the land the Inca once called Tawantinsuyu, the 4 quarters of the world. You are still in one of those quarters. You never left, and it never let go. You've crossed mountains, rivers, valleys, and time itself. And now, in your final days of wandering, you begin to see everything differently. The past isn't behind you anymore. It's all around. You carry it in your pack, tucked between the coca leaves and that quipu-shaped keychain a child handed you outside a train station. Even your breath hums to an old rhythm now, like a prayer to a god that might still be listening. You find yourself in a town near Cajamarca, the very place where Atahualpa once stood, dignified and doomed. Before a Spanish priest and a firing squad of paper and steel, the square has changed. Of course, there's a bronze statue now, a few plaques, a bakery where once there was panic. You sit on a bench, eating a sweet roll, wondering if any of the pigeons are reincarnated messengers. You visit the site where the ransom was held, the famous room that was once filled with gold and silver, in a desperate attempt to save an emperor's life. Now it's mostly empty, save for echoes and quiet reverence. You touch the walls, rough and cool, and you try to imagine the faces of the artisans who once melted their gods into coins and chains under Spanish orders. The ache in your chest isn't anger anymore. It's awe. They didn't save Atahualpa, but they saved something. Back in the town square, a school group gathers. The teacher tells the story of the fall of the Inca Empire, the ambush, the capture. But a child raises her hand and asks, "Did the Inca really end?" And the teacher smiles like someone who knows better than their textbook. "No," she says. "They changed form." You feel the truth of that as you travel north toward Chachapoyas, into the cloud forests. The roads are winding, but the names remain. Villages still carry Quechua syllables. Stories float in the fog like hummingbirds, quick, bright, and half mythical. You follow whispers to Cuelap, a fortress older than the Inca, built by a people the empire absorbed but never erased. It reminds you that even the Inca were once the new kids on the block. As you walk the ridges, you think about empire, not just the Incas, but all empires. Rome, Britain, Spain, they all rise, shine, and fall, believing themselves eternal. But the Inca, they're a different kind of immortal. They live not in marble or memoirs, but in water channels, still working. In potato seeds, carried across oceans. In the curve of a woven sash worn by a grandmother in La Paz and a fashion student in Lima. You stop at a roadside stall where a man sells belts. He tells you he learned his patterns from his grandmother, who learned from hers, and so on. You ask what they mean. He shrugs and says, "Some mean stars. Some mean lakes. One is a map to the old roads." You buy that one, further along the road. You stumble into a tiny museum, really just a home with labels, and find a wall covered in photographs of modern Quechua families. Farmers, midwives, teachers. One of them looks a little like you. Could be coincidence. Could be history winking. You spend the night in a tiny inn, where the floorboards creak in a language older than Spanish. The owner brings you hot soup and points out a woven tapestry above the hearth. It shows the Andean cosmology, condors in the sky, pumas on the land, serpents beneath. The three realms, still sacred, still stitched. You ask her if she believes in the old gods. She shrugs. "I believe they never stopped believing in us." The next morning, you descend into the jungle edges, where Inca expansion once hesitated. This was the edge of their known world. Even they, empire builders with ambition taller than mountains, respected the limits of nature. You feel it too, in the way the vines reach across trails, like they're trying to pull you into a dream. There, among half-swallowed ruins and tangled orchids, you sit and think of all that's come before. Of Viracocha walking the coast in the myths. Of Pachacuti reshaping cities in time. Of Huayna Capac dying from disease. No prayer could cure. Of Atahualpa, betrayed. Of Tupac Amaru, silent beneath Spanish steel. Of you quiet, steady, carrying their echoes. A monkey howls in the distance. Leaves rustle. Somewhere, water laughs its endless syllable. You laugh too. Later, in a small riverside town, you watch a local play panpipes in front of a mural showing the Quapac Yan stretching across South America like a stitched scar. He plays a melody that's not sad, not happy, just deep. Old. You hum along. It's a tune you've never heard but somehow already know. A child sits beside you. She holds a small doll dressed in traditional clothing, complete with miniature sling and sandals. She points at the doll's belt and says, "That's for protection." You nod. From what she asks, you smile. From forgetting. The child considers that and goes back to playing. You walk back to your lodging under a sky thick with stars. And it hits you. The empire is not ruins. Not royalty. Not gold. It's repetition. It's people doing the same things their ancestors did, planting, weaving, singing, raising children who also plant, weave, sing. It's not an empire you can invade. It's one you live. You're home again, though that word feels loose now. Like a shawl worn thin but warm with use. You're back in the highlands. In a quiet village where adobe walls lean gently against each other. And the breeze carries the scent of wood smoke, sheep, and something baking that smells like childhood. Your journey is complete, but the path still pulses beneath your soles. You've walked the empire, lived its echo, and now you've returned to watch what it becomes next. You rent a small stone house just outside town, tucked against the slope of a hill that was once part of an Inca terrace. The stones are ancient. Your landlord tells you the wall stood long before his grandfather's grandfather's time. You nod and run your hands over the surface, rough in places, smooth in others. The lichen here speaks Quechua, too. If you listen slowly enough, each morning, you rise with the sun. Not because you have to, just because it still feels right. You step outside and sip a hot cup of munya tea, staring out across fields patched in gold and green. Children run past, laughing, their sandals slapping against packed earth. One carries a slingshot. Another hums, a tune you swear was once sung to greet Inti on festival days. You spend your days helping neighbors fixing a collapsed canal, mending a thatched roof, sharing stories under shaded eaves. In the evenings, you sit by the fire and listen to the radio crackle between Quechua ballads and modern jingles. It's odd, but comforting, as if the empire and the internet finally decided they could share a room. One night, there's a festival in the plaza. Not a major one, just a local saint's day, but the energy is unmistakably Inca beneath its Catholic banner. Women wear embroidered skirts, filled with stars. Men dance with staffs that echo the royal vara of the old Sapa Inca. A young boy walks on stilts, representing the Apu spirit of a nearby mountain. Everyone cheers when he makes it across the plaza without falling. The mountain is pleased. Later, as the fire dies and the music winds down, you overhear an elder speaking to a girl who asked why they dance the way they do. "Because we are remembering," he says. "Even when we forget, our bodies remember." You help her tighten her sash. She asks if you used to dance like that. You smile. Once, maybe again. You begin teaching at the local school once a week. Not with textbooks, but with stories. You tell the children about the sacred valley, about the builders of Sacsayhuaman, about the messengers who ran without horses or wheels, but never lost a message. They stare with wide eyes. One of them asks if the Inca had superpowers. Yes. You say, they knew how to listen to mountains. When it rains, you read by candlelight old field notes, oral history transcriptions, collections of folk tales scribbled on the backs of receipts. You're working on your own quipu now, not to record numbers, but moments. You tie knots for things that made you feel alive. The sound of drums echoing off terraces. A sip of chicha that made you cry. A child's hand in yours. Learning to braid rope. You don't know if anyone will ever read it. Or even understand it. That's not the point. You just want it to exist. Your neighbors begin to bring you things: an old spindle, a clay figurine, a flute carved from bone. This belonged to my uncle, they say. Or maybe someone older. You accept them. Not to hoard, but to witness. To remind the objects they're still seen. One day, a young anthropologist visits from Lima. She's writing her thesis on cultural continuity in Andean communities. She brings you a clipboard, a recorder. Too many questions. But she listens, really listens. You show her your quipu. Her eyes widen. Do you think anyone will understand this in the future? She asks. You shrug. Maybe. But even if they don't, they'll know someone cared enough to tie it. She smiles and writes that down. You sit together, watching the sunset spill across the hills like molten gold, and talk about all that remains. The language, the terraces, the dances, the memory tucked into cooking pots and crumbling footpaths. You realize that the Inca didn't just build an empire, they built a rhythm. And rhythms don't end. They echo, back inside. You light one last candle for the night. You press your palm to the adobe wall and whisper a small prayer, not in Spanish, not even in Quechua. Just in the quiet rhythm of your own breath. The room answers with creaks and sighs. You think this is what it means to live inside history. Outside, the stars appear one by one, exactly as they did when Pachacuti first dreamed of stone and sky. The Milky Way flows above you, like a celestial river Mayu, the heavenly reflection of the rivers that still carry snowmelt to the terraces. And, somewhere, in 1,000 homes across the Andes, people drift to sleep with these same stars overhead. You close your eyes and breathe in the silence. And you know the empire lives, not in conquest, but in care, not in stone, but in stories, not in gold, but in memory. Now, let it all settle. Let the echo of the footsteps fade behind you. The rhythm of sandals brushing ancient trails. The hush of sacred mountains keeping their eternal watch. The empire, with all its roads and rivers and rhythms, has wrapped around you like a woven cloak, one spun not of power, but of persistence, of quiet care, of memory, passed gently from hand to hand, from word to word, across the soft fabric of generations. Breathe in now, and imagine the terraces at dawn fog clinging to the fields, sunlight stretching over each level like a golden blanket. A farmer stoops to press seeds into soil, humming a tune she learned before she could walk. Somewhere, a child ties a knot into a string and doesn't know she's telling a story. The wind carries it all: your footsteps, your laughter, your remembering into the folds of the mountains, where it rests with everything else that's ever mattered. You're not walking anymore. You're floating now, lulled by the soft breath of history, exhaled in stone. In song. In silence. There's no urgency, no schedule, no empire to build or defend. Just you, held in the quiet memory of something vast. Something that never needed to survive in marble, because it never died at all. So close your eyes. Let the stars rearrange themselves into constellations. Only, you can see. Let the last drumbeat fade into your pulse. You've wandered far and brought the story home with you. Now it can rest. and so can you. Sweet dreams.